Hey guys, tonight we're pouring into something a little different. Not a battle, not a treasure map, but the thing sitting quietly in the hold that made most of the rest of pirate history possible. A drink so central to life at sea that a ship could run out of fresh water and survive, but run out of rum and start plotting mutiny by sundown. We're talking about a spirit that was born from the ash and cane smoke of Barbados sugar plantations in the 1650s, that armed British admirals nicknamed after their own coats, and that, on at least one well-documented occasion in November of 1970, was marched off a warship in a coffin while sailors wept. Welcome to the strange, sticky 3-century story of rum, the drink that kept pirate crews alive, kept them loyal, kept them entertained through months of monotony, and, with startling regularity, killed them anyway. Before we get comfortable, dim the lights and maybe let a fan hum low in the background like wind moving through rigging, salty, steady, below deck's white noise. You're warm right now, tucked in. Nothing more dangerous nearby than a cold cup of water. That won't be true where we're going. So settle in, let your shoulders drop, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up smelling it before you see it. That's the thing nobody tells you about a pirate ship's morning. It isn't gunpowder, and it isn't the sea. It's damp oak, tar, unwashed wool, and underneath all of it, sweet and faintly rotten, the smell of rum that's soaked into the deckboards so many times over so many years that the wood itself seems to sweat it. You're below in the forecastle, wedged into a hammock that some previous, presumably shorter, sailor strung a little too close to a beam. And the first sound you register is not a bell or a boatswain's whistle. It's the particular clunk of a wooden cask being rolled across planking somewhere toward the main hatch. Your body knows what that means before your brain catches up. It's ration time. Here's the thing about that sound. It is, in a very real sense, the most reliable clock on the entire ship. Golden Age pirate vessels, the kind sailing out of havens like Nassau in the Bahamas between roughly 1715 and 1725, didn't run on strict naval timetables the way a Royal Navy man of war did. There was no uniform, no formal watch bell schedule enforced by an officer with the authority to flog you into obedience. What there was, almost universally, was rum, and the rough daily rhythm it created. You roll out of the hammock, your bare feet finding the cold, slightly tacky planks, and you follow the sound toward the hatch, past men who look considerably worse than you feel, toward the one ritual every single soul aboard has in common, from the captain who has voted into his post by show of hands, down to the powder monkey who isn't old enough to grow a proper beard yet. The morning dram isn't decadence, it's infrastructure. Fresh water aboard an 18th century sailing vessel turned foul within a couple of weeks. Algae, slime, a smell that could clear a room, stored as it was in reused wooden casks that had usually held wine, or fish, or worse, before anyone thought to fill them with drinking water. Rum, by contrast, didn't spoil. It killed the things that made water dangerous, it travelled well in the heat, and it gave 400 exhausted, underfed, frequently terrified men a reason to get vertical in the morning. So you drink. Not much. A few ounces, maybe watered, maybe not, depending on the captain and the state of the stores. But enough to cut the taste of everything else you're about to eat, and enough to remind you that whatever else this life is, it is, this morning at least, still going. The man doling it out has a cracked pewter cup he uses to measure, chipped along one rim in a way that means it holds slightly less than it should. And everyone on this ship knows it, and everyone has decided not to make it a hanging matter. His name is Tobias Fenwick, and he is, by vote of the whole company, your quartermaster. The second most powerful man aboard, and on many pirate ships, arguably the more important one day to day, since he's the one who enforces the ship's written articles, settles disputes over shares, and, this morning, controls the tap on the only cask that matters. Fenwick hums while he pours. Nobody's ever asked him why. It's a habit that's outlasted at least 2 ships, according to the older hands, and it's oddly steadying. A thin, tuneless little sound threading under the creak of the hull, telling you, more than any words could, that this particular morning is an ordinary one. Here's what makes this different from almost any other job available to a working man in the 1710s Atlantic world. You had a say in how this ration was decided. Before this ship ever left port, its crew sat down and voted on a set of written articles, the rules governing shares of plunder, punishments for offences, and yes, provisions, including how the rum would be distributed. That document is real, and versions of it survive in trial records from the period, because captured pirates were sometimes made to produce them in court. You didn't get that on a merchant vessel. You certainly didn't get that in the Royal Navy, where an officer with a King's Commission decided your ration, your punishment, and frequently your death, with no vote required. On this ship, the rum in Tobias Fenwick's cracked cup is one of the only things in your entire miserable, dangerous, wildly illegal life that you technically had a hand in deciding. That does not make it healthy. You'll get to that. By the time the sun's fully up and the deck's dry enough to work, the rum ration has done its job. A few hundred men who might otherwise have spent the morning nursing grievances are instead hauling line, checking the rigging, and grumbling about breakfast, which is a considerable improvement in shipboard morale for the price of a few ounces of distilled cane spirit. It's a small ritual. It is, in its own strange way, one of the more humane things about a life that otherwise offered very little humanity at all, and it's also, as you're about to find out over the course of this particular voyage, a habit with teeth. 3 weeks out of Nassau, the rum ration stops feeling like comfort and starts feeling like arithmetic. Here's the problem nobody mentions when they romanticize this life. A pirate ship carries a finite number of casks, and every single one of them has to last until the next prize is taken, the next port is reached, or the next island is raided for supplies, whichever comes first, and none of those things run on a schedule. Fenwick keeps a tally chalked on a slate nailed near the hatch, and by the third week, that tally has him doing the same grim math every single morning. How many casks remain, divided by how many days the captain estimates before landfall, multiplied by the uncomfortable knowledge that pirates, as a rule, do not react well to being told the rum is running short. You watch him recalculate, watch his lips move slightly as he does it, and you understand, in a way you didn't 3 weeks ago, that the tally on that slate is doing more to keep this ship from tearing itself apart than the cannon lashed to the deck ever will. By your second prize taken, a small merchant sloop out of Charleston, boarded without much of a fight once her captain saw your numbers, the crew's mood shifts overnight, and it isn't the coin in her hold that does it. It's the casks. Word runs through the ship, before the boarding party's even finished searching below, she's carrying rum, several barrels of it, bound for a planter's table in the Carolinas, who will now, through no fault of his own, be drinking considerably less this season. The reaction aboard your ship is immediate and almost embarrassingly joyful grown men who've weathered storms without flinching are grinning like children, and Fenwick, of all people, actually stops humming, because for once he doesn't need the sound to keep himself calm. Here's the dry truth of it. A pirate crew could tolerate a light purse a lot more easily than a light rum cask, and everyone aboard, from the captain down, knew exactly which cargo mattered more to keeping 400 armed men from turning on each other. That night, the ration gets doubled without anyone voting on it, which tells you something too. Some rules bend the instant abundance arrives, no matter what the articles say on paper. The celebration doesn't last past sunrise, though, because the very same articles that guarantee your share and your compensation for injury also, without exception, forbid drunkenness at the wrong moment. Nearly every surviving set of pirate articles from this period, the ones read into Admiralty court records after a crew was captured, carries some version of the same clause. No man is to be found drunk during an engagement, on pain of whatever punishment the company decides, up to and including marooning on the nearest spit of sand with a pistol, a little powder, and no further ceremony. It's a strange rule to hold in your head at the same time as the morning ration, but it makes a certain brutal sense. Rum kept the crew loyal, calm, and functional through the long stretches of boredom that made up most of a pirate's actual life. The same rum, mishandled at the one moment that counted, could get every man aboard killed. So the articles drew a hard line, and everyone signed it willingly, because everyone understood the difference between a nightcap and a liability. A topman 2 decks over got a taste of that line firsthand the week before you joined this crew, or so you're told, caught fumbling a line during a chase because he'd gotten into the surgeon's medicinal stock before his watch. And the vote to maroon him passed by a fair margin, though in the end the captain argued him down to a flogging instead, on the grounds that a live sailor short-won dignity was still more useful than a dead one. You never learn his name, you just learn the lesson. News travels strangely at sea, second-hand and salted with exaggeration by the time it reaches you. And it's a lookout named Amos Pettibone, a wiry Bristol man with a knack for spotting sail before anyone else on deck, who brings you the story that puts the whole arrangement in perspective. Pettibone spent 2 years aboard a merchantman before pirates took her and gave him the choice every captured sailor got: sign the articles and join, or take your chances rowing for shore. He tells it flat, without much drama, the way men do when the memory still sits close to the surface. How the merchant captain rationed water like it was gold and rum like it was poison, doling out neither with any consistency, punishing thirst as insubordination, so that men went weeks half mad with dehydration, while casks sat locked in the hold against a captain who trusted nobody. 2 men died of what Pettibone still calls the flux before they ever saw a pirate flag, and by the time the boarding party came aboard, half the crew signed the articles before the ink was dry, rum ration and all, no persuasion required. It isn't a happy story, but it's the reason nobody aboard your ship questions why the rum matters as much as it does, and it's the reason Tobias Fenwick's cracked pewter cup gets treated, by unspoken agreement, like something closer to a sacrament than a chore. Here's where Tobias Fenwick's fate becomes the emotional centre of this particular stretch of the voyage, because 6 weeks later, during a scramble to secure a loose cannon in rough seas, his right hand gets crushed between the gun carriage and the rail. It's the kind of injury that ended careers, and often lives, in this era, no anaesthesia beyond whatever spirit was on hand, no antibiotics, just a ship's surgeon with a saw, a hot iron, and whatever nerve he could muster. What happens next is worth sitting with, because it's one of the places where the popular image of piracy, chaos, cruelty, every man for himself, runs headlong into the documented reality. Under the written articles that this crew voted on before ever leaving port, the loss of a right hand carried a set compensation, paid out of the ship's plunder before any other shares were divided, precisely because everyone aboard understood that a man who lost a hand for the company's benefit shouldn't be left to beg. Surviving articles from real pirate ships of this exact period specify sums for a lost eye, a lost limb, sometimes with the right hand valued higher than the left, on the practical grounds that most men needed it more. Fenwick gets his rum first, more of it than the ration allows, poured not by measure this time but by mercy, and he bites down on a strip of leather while the surgeon works. He survives. He keeps his post, learns to pour with his left hand within a month, and the tally slate gets a new set of marks in a slightly different hand. It isn't a happy ending exactly, but it's not nothing, either, a documented practice on real ships that meant a man maimed in this brutal trade wasn't simply thrown over the side and forgotten, the way he likely would have been on almost any other vessel of the age. A dead calm hits you 9 days after Fenwick's injury, and this is where the ration's darker arithmetic shows its face again. No wind means no progress means the captain's estimate of days until landfall stretches out with nothing to anchor it, and Fenwick's tally slate, still kept faithfully in his newly steady left hand, starts reading numbers nobody wants to say out loud. Here's the thing about a becalmed pirate ship. 400 men with nothing to do and a shrinking rum supply is a genuinely dangerous combination, more dangerous in its way than a hurricane, because a storm at least gives everyone something to fight together. Boredom fights nobody but itself. The captain, voted into the post and just as easily voted out of it, which every man aboard understands is a live possibility not a formality, makes the unpopular call to cut the ration by a third until the wind returns, and for 2 days the ship simmers with the kind of quiet resentment that, on lesser crews, has ended in mutiny over less. What saves the mood, oddly enough, is dice. Someone produces a battered set below decks, and within an hour-half the crew is gathered in a loose circle on the main deck, wagering the one currency that still feels like it matters: tomorrow's ration. Today's ration. Sometimes a man's entire week's allowance staked on a single throw. It's reckless. It's also, by every account that survives from period trial depositions of captured pirates describing life aboard, exactly how these crews spent an enormous amount of their downtime gambling with money, with rum, with whatever small comforts a hard life afforded them. Because a life this precarious made long-term planning feel almost beside the point. You watch a young forced man pressed into service off a captured merchantman only a month back, still uneasy with the whole arrangement, lose 3 days of ration in under a minute and laugh about it anyway, because the alternative is sitting in the heat, thinking about how thin the water's gotten. Fenwick doesn't join the game. He never does. He just keeps pouring, keeps humming, keeps the tally, the one steady hand, figuratively, now literally only the one, holding the whole fragile arrangement together. The wind returns on the 11th day, and the relief that moves through the ship is almost physical, a held breath finally let go. Here's the dry joke that goes round within the hour. The kind pirates apparently couldn't resist even at their most relieved. Someone remarks that Poseidon himself must run on the same ration schedule the crew does, and go dry for a few days now and then. It's not a good joke. Nobody aboard has ever claimed pirates were great comedians. But it lands, because everyone needed to laugh at something, and the wind in the sails feels, for the moment, like the whole ship exhaling at once. Full rations resume before nightfall, and Fenwick's tally slate gets wiped clean and started fresh. The numbers that terrified everyone 2 days ago erased like they never happened. By evening the ration comes round one final time, and this is the part of the day you've come to treasure most, whether you'd admit it or not. The sun's dropping fast the way it does in these latitudes, the deck's gone the colour of an old bruise, and Fenwick works his way down the line with his left hand steady now, humming that same tuneless little song. Someone near the bow raises a cup and offers the old toast, one hand for the ship, one for the bottle, a saying that shows up, in one form or another, across enough period accounts of sailors' life that it's safe to call it genuine folk wisdom rather than legend. A wry little acknowledgement that a sailor needed to keep half his attention on staying alive and could be forgiven for giving the other, half to something that made the staying alive part bearable. Fenwick, holding his cup a little awkwardly in his newly dominant left hand, doesn't laugh at the joke this time. He just drinks. You're not warm tonight. The winds come up cold off the water, and there's nothing between you and the Atlantic but a few inches of oak and whatever's left in your cup. But you're fed, you're paid a fair share by the standards of your century, and the man who lost his hand for this ship is still standing beside you, pouring for the next man in line. Somewhere out past the rail, phosphorescence flickers in the ship's wake, and for one quiet moment before the watch changes and the work starts again, it's almost peaceful. Almost tomorrow the tally slate will read a little lower and the math will start again. But tonight the rum holds. And so, somehow, does everyone drinking it. Below, in the dark, you can hear the ship settling the way old wood does, ticking and groaning as the temperature drops, and somewhere near the bow a man who lost 3 days' ration to the dice is telling anyone who'll listen that he's owed a rematch. Nobody takes him up on it tonight. There's a kind of unspoken agreement, after a stretch like the one you've just had, that a ship needs one evening of simply being quiet together, watching the same patch of stars, breathing the same salt air, before the ordinary chaos resumes tomorrow. Fenwick finishes his rounds, wipes the slate with the flat of his good hand, and settles against a coil of rope near the mainmast, still humming, low enough now that you have to strain to catch the tune at all. It's not a lullaby. It's just a man marking the end of another day the way he's always marked it, whether anyone's listening or not. You think, drifting towards sleep in a hammock that still isn't strung quite right, about how strange it is that a cask of distilled cane juice has become the thing holding an entire ship of desperate, dangerous, illegal men together. More than the guns, more than the flag. More than the fear of the noose that waits for every one of you if this voyage goes wrong. It didn't start here, though. It didn't start with pirates at all. Long before Tobias Fenwick ever poured a ration into a cracked pewter cup, this drink had another life entirely, one considerably darker than anything you've seen tonight, born not on a ship, but in the boiling houses of a Caribbean island, out of cane fields worked by men and women who had no articles, no vote, and no share of anything at all. The boiling house at Three Houses Plantation, on the southeastern coast of Barbados, never really goes quiet. Even at 2 a.m. in the spring of 1651, the fires beneath the great copper kettles have to be tended, because sugar cane juice starts to sour within hours of being cut, and an island that has staked its entire fortune on sugar cannot afford to let a single harvest spoil for want of a stoked fire. The heat inside that bluestone building is, by every surviving account of the period, almost unbearable even at night. Thick, sweet, suffocating air that clings to skin and clothing, lit orange by kettle fires that never fully die. It's in a building very much like this one, on an island very much like this one, that the historical record's earliest known written reference to rum turns up. A 1651 document describing the island's chief drink as rumbullion, alias kill divil, a hot, hellish liquor, it says, made of sugar canes distilled, and notoriously fierce enough to justify the second half of its name. The kettles themselves were arranged in a descending row, largest to smallest, so the boiling juice could be ladled from one to the next as it thickened. A process called striking that required a skilled boiler man to judge by eye and by the sound of the bubbling exactly when to move it along. A single misjudged moment enough to scorch an entire batch and waste a day's cutting. Nobody is entirely certain where either word came from, and that uncertainty is worth sitting with rather than smoothing over. Kill devil is the easier of the two to explain. Colonists on Barbados in the mid-17th century were producing a raw, unaged, occasionally impurity-laced spirit straight off the still, and if you've ever had genuinely rough moonshine, you already understand why a drink strong and crude enough to seemingly kill a devil might earn the nickname honestly. Rumbullion is murkier. Some historians trace it to an old West Country English dialect word meaning a great tumult or uproar, which would make plenty of sense as a description of what the drink did to the men who consumed it. Others suggest a link to rummer, a large drinking glass already in use in parts of Europe. The honest answer, and the one worth giving you rather than a tidier one, is that etymologists still argue about it, and probably always will, because nobody thought to write down the reasoning at the time. They were too busy building an economy on the back of it. That economy is the part of this story that can't be softened, and shouldn't be. Barbados in the 1640s had been a modest English colony scraping by on tobacco and cotton, crops that grew poorly on the island's thin soil and couldn't compete with Virginia's or the Levant's better product. Everything changed within roughly a single decade. As planters, watching Dutch traders and Portuguese Brazil demonstrate what sugarcane could earn on the European market, tore out their old fields and replanted with cane, an almost total agricultural conversion historians now call the Sugar Revolution. Sugar is a brutally labour-intensive crop, requiring near-constant cutting, hauling, boiling and skimming during harvest, work that Barbadian planters increasingly forced onto enslaved Africans, whose numbers on the island rose from a few hundred in the 1630s to tens of thousands within a generation. Rum did not cause that horror. But rum was its byproduct in the most literal, physical sense, a drink distilled from molasses, which is itself the sticky. Unsellable runoff left over after sugar crystals had been boiled and skimmed out of cane juice, syrup that would otherwise have simply gone to waste. Here's the process, stripped down to its mechanics. Because it matters for understanding everything that follows. Cut cane gets crushed to extract juice. The juice is boiled down through a series of copper kettles until sugar crystals form, and are skimmed off for sale, and what's left behind, dark, thick, still faintly sweet molasses, ferments on its own within days in the Caribbean heat, given nothing more than time, wild yeast in the air, and patience. Distilled through a copper pot still, that fermented molasses becomes rum. Planters had, in other words, stumbled onto a way to turn their own waste product into a second highly profitable export, and by the 1650s, Barbados alone was reportedly producing rum by the tens of thousands of gallons annually, sold to visiting ships, consumed on the island and increasingly shipped onward across the Atlantic world. The still itself, on a plantation like this one, was rarely tended by the planter whose name appears in the surviving ledgers. It was tended by an enslaved distiller, a role that required real skill since judging fermentation by smell and taste, and knowing precisely when to cut the heads and tails of a distillation run to avoid a batch contaminated with dangerous methanol took years to learn properly. No name from Three Houses Plantation survives for the man who likely held that role in 1651, the historical record, as it so often does for enslaved individuals of this period, kept meticulous accounts of gallons and profits and almost nothing of the people who produced them. So picture him not as a documented figure, but as a composite of thousands like him across the Caribbean sugar islands, a man who understood, better than the planter who owned him, exactly how this drink was made, whose knowledge was extracted from him the same way the sugar was extracted from the cane, and whose name history simply declined to keep. It's worth sitting with that absence for a moment rather than rushing past it, because everything joyful this drink would go on to mean for pirate crews a few decades later was built, quite literally, on a foundation the record chose not to remember. A few years after that 1651 mention of Rumbullion and Kill Devil, an English gentleman named Richard Lygon published a detailed account of the roughly 3 years he'd spent on Barbados, and his book remains one of the richest surviving windows into exactly this world. The sugar boom, the boiling houses, the brutal labour that sustained them. Lygon wasn't a planter himself, but a visitor with an eye for detail and, by the standards of his century, an unusually observant one, and his descriptions of the island's plantations, its enslaved workforce, and its drink have been quoted by historians of the Caribbean ever since, precisely because so few other written accounts from this early period survive at all. He describes an island transformed almost beyond recognition within a single decade. Fields that had grown tobacco and cotton now given over entirely to cane, fortunes made and unmade on a single season's harvest, and a labour system whose scale and cruelty even a man of his era found worth remarking on at length. It's through accounts like his, cross-referenced against surviving plantation ledgers and colonial shipping records, that historians have been able to reconstruct just how fast this transformation happened, and just how much of its foundation history simply failed to record in any personal detail at all. The hard numbers, where they survive, are staggering enough to need no embellishment. Barbados's enslaved population is estimated to have grown from perhaps 2,000 people in the early 1640s to well over 20,000 by 1660, a roughly tenfold increase inside 20 years, driven entirely by the labour demands of the new sugar economy. By some later estimates, the island was importing enslaved Africans at a rate of several thousand per year by the 1680s, just to sustain and expand its plantations, a horrifying velocity that reflects how quickly sugar and the rum distilled from its waste had become the engine of the entire English Caribbean. None of that history sits comfortably next to a story about pirate morning rations and dice games on a becalmed deck. It isn't meant to. It's meant to sit exactly as uncomfortably as it should, because leaving it out would make this drink's story into something lighter and simpler than it actually was. Word of Barbadian rum spread fast, the way profitable things do. Within 20 years, Jamaica, seized from Spain by an English force in 1655, had its own booming rum industry, arguably eclipsing Barbados by the 1670s, thanks to richer land, larger plantations, and a climate that produced a noticeably darker, heavier spirit than its neighbours. Sailors and merchants of the period genuinely could, and did, tell the difference by taste alone, Jamaican rum ran thick and full-bodied, prized by some captains precisely because its strength meant a little went further in a ration. Barbadian rum was generally lighter and, by most surviving accounts, considered somewhat more refined. More likely to turn up on a planter's own table than in a sailor's tin cup. The French colonial islands, Martinique and Guadeloupe chief among them, developed a parallel but genuinely distinct tradition, distilling directly from fresh-pressed cane juice rather than fermented molasses, a style still called rum agricole today and still legally distinguished from the molasses-based rum that dominated the English Caribbean. Even Brazil, under Portuguese control, was producing its own cane spirit by this period, a cousin to rum called cacha that followed a broadly similar path from waste product to Atlantic commodity, though it developed along its own separate track and rarely turns up in English pirate-era accounts at all. Each island's rum carried its own character, its own reputation, and its own price on the docks of a dozen Atlantic ports, and a pirate crew boarding a merchant vessel could often guess, roughly, where she'd loaded her cargo just from the smell of the cask before anyone bothered to check the manifest. By the turn of the 18th century, rum had become one of the defining commodities of the entire colonial trading system, not the most valuable, by weight, but arguably the most universally wanted, from the grandest planter's parlour down to the lowest forecastle hammock. That system had a name, and it wasn't a flattering one, even by the standards of its own century. Historians now call it the triangular trade, a brutal circuit connecting 3 points around the Atlantic. Manufactured goods, and, crucially, rum travelled from New England and Europe to the West African coast, where they were traded, alongside firearms and cloth, for enslaved people. Those enslaved people were carried across the Atlantic, the horror of the Middle Passage, to the Caribbean and American colonies, where they were sold into the plantation labour that produced sugar and molasses. That molasses sailed north to New England distilleries, in Boston, Newport and Medford, where it became rum again, completing the loop. By the early 1700s, Rhode Island alone reportedly hosted dozens of small rum distilleries, many of them built specifically to supply the African trade, where a gallon of New England rum could purchase goods, and grimly people. On a coast thousands of miles from where the cane that made it had grown. This is not a comfortable fact to fold into a story about pirate camaraderie and morning rations. It belongs here anyway, because the rum in Tobias Fenwick's cask, 3 chapters from now in this story's own internal timeline, didn't arrive on that ship from nowhere. It arrived carrying this entire weight of trade and cruelty behind it, whether the men drinking it ever thought about where it came from or not. Pirates, as it happens, inherited this drink from an earlier and rougher tradition entirely. The buccaneers of the mid-17th century, loosely organised bands of hunters, smugglers and opportunists who based themselves on islands like Tortoise Island off the northern coast of Hispaniola and later in the boomtown chaos of Port Royal. Jamaica, Port Royal by the 1660s, had earned a reputation, recorded by more than one visiting clergyman with evident disapproval, as one of the wickedest and most drink-soaked ports in the English colonial world, a town where rum flowed cheaply and constantly to a population of privateers, smugglers and sailors flush with Spanish silver and little inclined toward moderation. A famous Welsh privateer of the era, Henry Morgan, operated out of Port Royal during exactly this period, and while the wilder tavern stories attached to his name have grown considerably in the retelling over 3 centuries, the underlying picture, a port economy substantially built around rum, prize money, and the taverns that took both off sailors' hands as fast as they arrived, is well documented in colonial correspondence and court records from the town itself. This, then, is the story of rum, the spirit distilled from a plantation's waste product, born out of an economic and moral catastrophe on a small Caribbean island in the 1650s, that somehow, within 2 generations, had become the single most important substance aboard nearly every pirate ship sailing the Atlantic and Caribbean. The thing that measured a crew's morale, financed their loyalty, and, as you're about to see, occasionally decided who lived and who didn't. There's a dry irony worth pausing on before we move past it, because it's the kind of detail that tends to survive in the historical record precisely because it's so quietly absurd. The same raw, unaged kill devil that had earned its brutal nickname in a 1651 Barbadian document was, within a single lifetime, being requested by name in taverns from Port Royal to Nassau, men specifically asking for the roughest, harshest pour available, on the apparent theory that a spirit fierce enough to be named after killing a devil was probably strong enough to be worth the money. Whether that reputation was earned through genuine potency or simple marketing bravado on the part of enterprising tavern keepers is, like so much from this period, impossible to say with certainty, but either way, Kill Devil sold, and it kept selling for the better part of a century. Port Royal itself gives this chapter one more grim, almost biblical footnote, and it's worth including precisely because so many period observers treated it as a kind of moral lesson at the time, whether or not modern historians would frame it the same way. On the morning of June 7th, 1692, a massive earthquake struck Jamaica, and roughly 2/3 of Port Royal, built, unluckily, on a sandspit prone to liquefaction, sank into the harbour within minutes, taking an estimated 2,000 or more residents down with it, with disease afterward claiming thousands more. Contemporary sermons and pamphlets back in England were quick to describe the disaster as divine punishment visited on a town notorious for drink, piracy, and vice, a reading modern seismologists obviously don't share, but one that tells you plenty about Port Royal's reputation among its own contemporaries. The rum kept flowing in Jamaica regardless. The island's plantations were untouched by the quake, and its rum industry, by then arguably the largest in the English Caribbean, barely paused. But the drowned town became, for at least a generation of English readers back home, a byword for what happened when rum, prize money and lawlessness were allowed to mix without restraint, and image pirates of the following Golden Age would inherit and, in their own way, live up to. The price of that rum tells its own quieter story about how central it had become to Atlantic trade by the early 1700s. Surviving colonial customs records and merchants' correspondence from ports like Boston and Bridgetown suggest a gallon of rum could run anywhere from roughly 2 to 4 shillings depending on quality, distance from the distillery. And how badly a given port needed it that season. Cheap enough that a modestly successful voyage could stock a ship's hold many times over, but valuable enough that entire cargoes of it were worth boarding a vessel for. Rum, unlike coin, didn't need to be divided into precise shares or smuggled past a customs officer quite so carefully. A cask was a cask, useful to drink, useful to trade. Useful to sell quietly to a sympathetic merchant in a haven port who asked no questions about where it had come from. It's not hard to see, given all of that, why a captured cask of rum could send a pirate crew into a rowdier celebration than a captured chest of silver. The silver had to be divided, guarded, and eventually spent carefully. The rum could simply be opened. It's worth pausing here to flag something that will matter for the rest of this story, because it starts creeping into the record right around this point in rum's history. Much of what later generations came to believe about early pirate and buccaneer drinking habits, the specific taverns, the colourful individual anecdotes, the exact wording of toasts and boasts, traces back to a single, hugely influential book published in 1724 called A General History of the Pirates, credited to a writer named Captain Charles Johnson, whose true identity is still debated by historians, and may have been a pseudonym for someone else entirely. Johnson's book is a genuinely important historical source, in that it's often the earliest surviving written account of many pirates who left no other record behind, but it's also a work known to have dramatised, embellished, and in at least a few identifiable cases, simply invented material for the sake of a better story. Which means later details attributed to it deserve the same according to legend caution as any other unverified tale, rather than being repeated as settled fact, where this account can lean instead on trial depositions, colonial governors' correspondence, ship's logs, and contemporary newspaper reports. It will. But it's honest to say up front that not everything about this era survives in a form that can be checked so cleanly. by the time Tobias Fenwick's ship, or any ship like it, set sail from a haven such as Nassau in the 1710s. The moral weight of that origin had mostly faded from the minds of the men drinking it, not erased exactly, but buried under 3 generations of trade, habit, and the simple fact that rum was cheap, plentiful, and everywhere in the Caribbean world a pirate operated in. What hadn't faded was the drink's sheer usefulness. A pirate captain in 1717 wasn't thinking about a Barbadian boiling house or an anonymous enslaved distiller's careful judgment of a fermentation smell. He was thinking about how many casks his quartermaster had chalked on a slate, how far they'd stretch, and what they could buy him beyond simple morale. Because by the time rum reached a pirate ship's hold, it had quietly become one of the most flexible, most negotiable things aboard, more useful in some ways than the coin everyone assumed mattered most. That usefulness is where the next part of this story picks up, because aboard a pirate ship, rum wasn't only a comfort or a ration, it was, in every practical sense that mattered to a crew, balanced on the edge of mutiny, poverty, and the noose. A currency in its own right, and following one cask of it through a single voyage tells you more about how a pirate economy actually functioned than any ledger of stolen silver ever could. You sign the articles with a rum cup still sweating on the table beside the quill. That's not incidental. It's practically ceremonial. Nassau's harbour in 1716 is a forest of masts belonging to ships that technically don't exist anymore. Former merchantmen, former privateers, vessels whose old names have been painted over and whose new captains were, a few months back, ordinary sailors with no particular claim to command beyond the fact that a majority of a crew decided to trust them. You're here because a merchant ship you served on legitimately, for wages that arrived late and often short, got taken by a sloop flying no colours at all, and the boarding captain gave you the same choice he gives everyone: sign or take a boat to shore, and your chances with it. Before you sign anything, someone puts a cup in your hand. It's not bribery exactly. Or not only that, it's an introduction to how this economy actually runs, not on coin alone, but on rum, freely offered, as the first and clearest signal that this ship intends to treat you better than the one you're leaving. The articles themselves get read aloud before anyone signs, which is more due process than you got on your last berth, and buried among the clauses about shares and punishments and the forbidden practice of gambling with dice for money aboard ship, allowed oddly with rum as the stake, but not with coin, on the theory that coin disputes turned violent faster than rum disputes did, is a line establishing exactly how the daily ration will be handled, and by whom. That whom, on this ship, is a barrel-chested Bristol-born cooper named Silas Grant, whose actual trade is building and maintaining the wooden casks that hold everything liquid aboard, from water to gunpowder to the rum itself, and whose unofficial second job, by unanimous informal agreement, is keeping an honest accounting of what's left. Grant has a habit of running his thumb along a cask's seams before he'll vouch for it, checking for the slow weeping leak that means a stave's gone bad, and he does the same absent little gesture you notice within your first week whenever anyone asks him a direct question about the tally, thumb along an invisible seam, like he's checking his own answer for leaks before he gives it. You learn Grant's own story in pieces, the way you learn most things aboard a ship where nobody sits you down for a proper conversation about their past. He wasn't a volunteer, not exactly, pressed off a Bristol merchantman 2 years back the same way you were pressed off yours, given the same choice at the point of a cutlass, and he's told more than one man, usually a few cups into an evening, that he's never quite decided whether he regrets making it. What he doesn't regret, he says, is the work itself. A cooper's trade is a genuinely valuable one aboard any ship, pirate or otherwise, and Grant takes a quiet, particular pride in it that has nothing to do with the violence around him. The precise curve of a stave, the tight watertight seal of a well-built cask, the small satisfaction of a job done correctly, in a life where very little else offers that kind of certainty. It's why the crew trusts him with the rum tally, without ever formally voting him into the role. Nobody doubts a man who cares that much about the vessel holding the drink actually caring, in turn, about how fairly it gets shared out. By your first week aboard, you understand that rum isn't simply consumed on this ship. It's spent, the way coin is spent, in transactions that would look bizarre to anyone who'd never lived this life. A junior hand who volunteers for the dangerous work of scraping and recalking the hull during careening, laid up on a beach, ship keeled over on her side, exposed and vulnerable the entire time, gets an extra ration that night, not because any article specifically requires it, but because everyone aboard understands that dangerous, unglamorous labour deserves a currency that coin, divided later and divided evenly, can't quite capture. You take a turn at it yourself 3 weeks out of Nassau, scraping barnacles and marine growth off the hull's underside in brutal heat with tar fumes thick enough to make your eyes water, and that evening Grant hands you a cup with noticeably more in it than the standard measure, says nothing, and moves on to the next man. It's a small transaction. It matters anyway. Rum buys silence too, and this is where the ship's economy shades into something closer to diplomacy. 6 weeks out, low on fresh water and running short on salted meat, your captain makes for a small half-official trading post on an out-of-the-way stretch of coast, the kind of place where a local factor, a merchant operating just outside the reach of any colonial governor's close attention, will quietly sell provisions to whoever pays, no questions asked about the buyer's business or the source of his coin. What that factor actually wants, though, isn't coin. He's got plenty of that already, and precious little of anything to spend it on out here. What he wants is rum. Good rum, several casks of it, offered as much of the payment as the fresh water and salt pork he's selling you in return. The negotiation takes most of an afternoon, conducted over shared cups on the factor's own crooked little porch, and by the time it's done, you've traded roughly a third of your remaining rum stores for provisions that will keep the whole crew alive for another month. A currency exchange that Silas Grant, chalk in hand, records on his slate with the same careful attention he'd give a transaction. In coin, because to him and to every man aboard it effectively is one. Before any of that, though, in your second week, you watch rum do a job that coin alone couldn't manage nearly as smoothly, buying a customs officer's short memory. Your ship needs a quiet night in a small colonial harbour to take on fresh water without drawing the attention of whatever naval patrol might be operating nearby, and the deputy customs officer stationed there underpaid, as most colonial officials of this rank genuinely were, and well aware that his own governor back in London had little practical ability to police every inlet along this stretch of coast, proves entirely willing to overlook a ship's suspicious lack of proper papers in exchange for 2 casks of good rum delivered quietly to his own. Residence after dark. It's a transaction that would look, on paper, like straightforward bribery, and in the strictest legal sense it is. But it's also, practically speaking, how an enormous amount of Atlantic trade actually functioned in this period, legitimate and otherwise, in ports where colonial administration was thin, salaries were low, and rum was one of the few gifts that required no awkward paper trail to explain. You don't see the officer's face. You only see 2 of your crewmates rowing a small boat toward the darkened shoreline with muffled oars, and returning an hour later considerably lighter in cargo and considerably more confident about your ship's welcome in that harbour come morning. You see the dark side of rum as currency up close in your 5th week, when a dispute over a dice game nearly turns to knives. 2 hands, a former fisherman named Corbett and a forced man barely 3 weeks into his service, argue over whether a stake of 2 days' ration was properly wagered or misheard in the dark, and the argument escalates fast enough that half the watch gathers around them before anyone thinks to intervene. Here's what happens next, and it's worth noting because it's exactly the kind of moment the written articles exist to prevent. Rather than let the dispute settle itself with fists or blades, the quartermaster, not Grant, on this particular ship, but a hard-eyed Welshman everyone simply calls Price, steps in and invokes the article governing exactly this situation, calling for the whole crew to arbitrate by vote rather than let 2 angry men decide it violently between themselves. It takes 20 minutes, a fair amount of shouting, and 1 recounting of the previous night's dice from 3 separate witnesses, but the vote goes in the forced man's favour. Corbett grumbles and pays out, and by morning the whole thing is treated as settled business rather than a grudge carried forward. You've seen disputes over far smaller stakes turn fatal on merchant ships, where no such mechanism existed and an officer's word alone decided who was believed. Here, rum caused the fight, and a rum-adjacent system of genuine, if rough, democracy ended it. There's a darker version of this same transaction, and you see it play out 9 weeks in, when your ship boards a small Portuguese trader with little cargo worth taking beyond a modest quantity of coin, and, more valuably to your captain's eye, a young Portuguese sailor with genuine skill at navigation, a talent your own ship is currently short on. The offer your captain makes him is straightforward and, by the standards of the era, not unusual. Sign the articles, take a full share, and drink freely from a ration considerably more generous than whatever a Portuguese merchant captain was doling out. The sailor, whose name you never quite catch properly through his accent and yours, hesitates for exactly as long as it takes someone to pour him a cup, drinks it, and signs. You watch it happen and understand, with a clarity that unsettles you slightly, that the rum wasn't incidental to that decision. It was the argument, made without a single additional word needing to be spoken. By your 3rd month at sea, the tally on Grant's slate has become the single number the entire crew watches more closely than any other. More closely even than the captain's estimate of prize money still owed from the last successful boarding. Rum running low means morale running low, means disputes settling less peacefully, means the whole fragile machinery of an all-volunteer elected captain, share-based economy starting to grind. You watch Grant recalculate one grey morning the same grim arithmetic Tobias Fenwick worked through on another ship in another version of this exact story. And you realise this isn't a coincidence particular to one crew or one captain. It's structural. Every pirate ship of this era, different flag, different captain, different articles in the particular wording, runs on roughly the same underlying currency, because there simply isn't a substitute for it available anywhere in this world that functions the same way. The crisis, when it comes, arrives 11 weeks out, during a stretch of bad luck that sees 2 attempted boardings go badly wrong, one prize escaping under sail before you can close the distance, another turning out to be nearly as heavily armed as your own ship and worth avoiding entirely. Casks run dangerously low, water's not much better, and the mood below decks curdles into the kind of low, simmering resentment that every experienced hand aboard recognises as dangerous. It's Silas Grant, of all people, who proposes the solution that gets you through it, rationing not by measure but by lottery, dice thrown each morning to determine who drinks first and who drinks last from what remains, a system that sounds needlessly cruel until you understand what it actually solves. It removes Grant himself from any accusation of favouritism, distributes the risk of a thin pour randomly rather than by rank or friendship, and gives the whole crew something they can point to as fair, even when fair still means going without. The captain approves it without much debate. Everyone aboard, including you, understands that a currency perceived as unjustly distributed causes more damage to a crew than a currency simply running short. You draw a low number on the worst morning of the crisis, and your cup comes back with barely enough to wet your tongue, and you go about your work that day thirstier and more foul-tempered than you've been in months, and you don't blame Grant for a second, because you watched him draw his own number honestly, right alongside everyone else, and take whatever the dice gave him without complaint. That, more than any article written and signed back in Nassau, is the thing that actually holds a crew like this together through a stretch like this one. Not the promise of fairness, but the visible, repeated proof of it, morning after morning, cup after cup. 12 weeks out, rum brokers a peace that gunpowder very nearly didn't. Your ship crosses paths with another pirate sloop off a stretch of coast neither crew particularly wants to fight over, both flying similar black colours, both uncertain for a tense quarter hour whether the other intends parley or battle. It's an old and, by several surviving accounts from the period, a fairly consistent custom among pirate crews of this era to settle such uncertain encounters Not with a first shot, but with an invitation, boats lowered, a handful of unarmed men rowed across open water under a flag of truce, and rum, always rum, offered as the first order of business once both parties are aboard the same deck. You're not among the men chosen to row across, but you watch from the rail as your captain and the other sloop's captain share cups on her quarterdeck for the better part of an hour, trading news of which colonial governors are currently offering pardons, which naval patrols have been sighted where, and which merchant routes are currently worth the risk. Nothing about that hour requires the rum specifically. Words alone could carry the same information. But a shared cup, offered and accepted, does something a mere conversation can't. It commits both sides, visibly and physically, to the fiction that this meeting is friendly. And in a world with no higher authority to enforce good behaviour between two armed crews of desperate men, that fiction, purchased for the price of a few rounds of rum, is sometimes the only thing standing between a peaceful parting and a bloody one. Relief arrives 14 weeks out, in the unglamorous form of a Dutch merchantman carrying, among other cargo, 11 full casks of good Jamaican rum, bound for a planter's household in Corral, who will once again be doing without this season. The celebration that night is loud enough that Grant abandons the tally slate entirely for the first time in 3 months, and you drink more than you probably should, and somewhere past midnight someone starts up a song nobody quite remembers the words to by the second verse, and it doesn't matter, because the point was never the words. The point was that the casks were full again, and for one night at least, the whole fragile economy holding this ship and this crew together could simply stop worrying about the arithmetic and enjoy what it had bought. Grant gets his own moment of reckoning in the 9th week, and it's worth telling because it's the quietest kind of heroism this life offers, the kind that never makes it into any captured captain's deposition or any Admiralty Court transcript. A cask breaks loose in the hold during a sudden squall, one of the last full rum barrels rolling free with the ship's violent pitching, and in a hold packed with gunpowder stores, lashed none too carefully against exactly this kind of chaos. A loose, heavy object rolling free in the dark is a genuinely serious danger, not merely to the rum, but to the whole ship, if it strikes the wrong barrel at the wrong angle. Grant goes down into that pitching, half-flooded hold alone, in the dark, and wedges himself bodily between the rolling cask and the powder store until 2 other hands can scramble down with lanterns and rope to lash it properly. He comes up soaked, bruised along one side badly enough that he can't sleep on it for a week, and characteristically says almost nothing about it beyond a dry remark that he'd rather take a bruise from a rum cask than an early grave from a powder store, delivered so flatly that it takes the men around him a moment to realise he's made a joke at all. Nobody votes him a bonus for it. Nobody writes it in any surviving record. But the crew's respect for him deepens in a way you can feel rather than measure, evident in the slightly larger pour he gets, unasked, from whoever's serving that week for the rest of the voyage. By the time you make port again, months later, poorer in some ways and considerably richer in others, you understand something about this life that no one back in Nassau explained to you when you signed. The coin you're owed, your fair share under the articles, will get divided, spent, gambled or stolen within weeks of reaching land, the way coin always is. But the rum, the daily, unglamorous, constantly recalculated rum, was never really about wealth at all. It was the thing that made the wealth worth chasing in the first place, the currency that measured trust, bought loyalty, settled disputes, and on the worst mornings reminded 400 desperate men that they were still, whatever else might be said about them, being treated fairly by the only government most of them would ever choose for themselves. Grant hands you your last cup before you go ashore, a full measure, no shorting, thumb running once along the rim of the cask out of pure habit, rather than any real doubt about its condition. You don't know yet whether you'll sail with this crew again, whether the articles you signed in Nassau will still bind you 6 months from now, or whether Grant himself will still be standing at that cask the next time you see this deck. Nobody on a ship like this plans that far ahead, the currency you've all been trading in, cup by cup, vote by vote, cask by cask, was never designed for long horizons. It was designed to get 400 men through one more day, one more storm, one more dead calm, fairly enough that nobody felt cheated badly enough to reach for a blade. On those terms, whatever else this voyage cost you, the currency held. Not every government agreed that rum, freely and generously given, was the right way to run a ship. Nearly 100 years after your voyage, an English admiral would reach the opposite conclusion entirely, and in doing so, accidentally invent one of the most famous words in naval history. Every pirate crew this story has followed so far learned to manage rum's dangers themselves, through elected quartermasters, written articles, and a rough peer enforced fairness that, whatever its flaws, kept most ships functioning. It would take the world's most powerful navy considerably longer to reach the same basic conclusion, and when it finally did, in August of 1740, the order came down from a single admiral's cabin, was read aloud on deck to sailors who very nearly mutinied over it, and permanently changed the English language along the way. The fleet anchored off Port Royal, Jamaica, in the late summer of 1740, was under the command of Vice Admiral Edward Vernon, a 56-year-old officer whose reputation at that particular moment could scarcely have been higher. The year before, in November of 1739, Vernon had led a squadron of just 6 ships against the heavily fortified Spanish port of Portobello on the Isthmus of Panama, and taken it within a single day. A victory so celebrated back in England that it became, briefly, one of the most famous military feats of the entire century, commemorated in street names, tavern signs, and even a birthday party thrown by the mother of a young George Washington, who named his family's Virginia estate Mount Vernon in the Admiral's honour a few years later, a connection that still surprises people today. Vernon had earned, in short, the kind of standing that let a naval officer issue an unpopular order and actually make it stick. Vernon was, by the standards of his own service, an unusually outspoken officer, the kind of man who wrote lengthy, sharply worded letters to the Admiralty back in London, criticising everything from ship design to victualling contracts to the competence of fellow officers, a habit that had earned him both admirers and enemies over a career stretching back to his first commission in 1700. He'd served in the Mediterranean, the Baltic, and along the American coast before Portobello made him briefly the most famous naval officer in the English-speaking world. And it's worth noting, since this story has already spent considerable time on the darker side of Atlantic trade, that Vernon's fame arrived at almost the exact same moment, and in almost the exact same waters, where pirate crews like the ones already followed in this account had spent the previous 2 decades operating. By 1740, the worst of the Golden Age of Piracy was largely over, hunted down by exactly the kind of naval power Vernon commanded, but the Caribbean world he sailed into was still shaped by everything that era had left behind: the taverns, the trade routes, and the deeply entrenched expectation among ordinary sailors of every stripe that rum was owed to them, generously and without dilution, as one of the few genuine comforts available in an otherwise miserable trade. He needed every ounce of that standing for what came next, because the problem he'd set out to fix was one the Royal Navy had been quietly enabling for nearly a century. Since the English seizure of Jamaica in 1655, ships stationed in the Caribbean had gradually shifted from issuing sailors' beer or brandy, the traditional Royal Navy rations, to issuing rum instead, simply because rum was locally abundant, cheap, and didn't spoil the way shipboard beer did in tropical heat. By the 1740s, a Royal Navy sailor's daily ration in Caribbean waters commonly ran to a full half-pint of rum, undiluted, served neat, a quantity that distributed to thousands of men across an entire fleet produced exactly the level of chronic drunkenness you'd expect. Vernon's own correspondence from this period, preserved in naval archives, describes his growing alarm at seeing men so consistently intoxicated that discipline, seamanship, and basic safety aboard ship were all suffering for it, sailors falling from rigging, botching orders, and racking up floggable offences at a rate that concerned him far more than any enemy fleet did. Vernon's solution issued as a fleet-wide order on August 21st, 1740, was simple in concept and, to the men receiving it, deeply unwelcome in practice. The half-pint rum ration would no longer be served neat. It would be mixed with a quart of water, split into 2 servings across the day rather than 1, and, in a detail that mattered more than it might sound, mixed openly on deck under an officer's supervision, rather than issued as a raw measure a sailor could hoard, trade, or drink all at once. Vernon reasoned, correctly as it turned out, that diluted rum spoiled faster once mixed, which meant sailors could no longer save up several days' rations for one devastating binge, a practice that had apparently become common enough to worry him. The order additionally suggested, though didn't strictly mandate on every ship, the addition of sugar and lime juice to make the diluted mixture more palatable, an addition that would matter enormously to naval medicine a few decades later, for reasons nobody serving under Vernon could have anticipated. The reaction among the fleet's sailors was, by every surviving account, somewhere between furious and mutinous. Undiluted rum had become, over the better part of a century, something sailors regarded as an earned right rather than a privilege an admiral could simply revise downward, and more than one contemporary account describes grumbling serious enough that officers worried openly about outright refusal to comply. What saved Vernon from a genuine crisis of discipline was, in a strange twist, his own reputation. The same hero of Porto Bayo ordering the change made it considerably harder for sailors to frame their objection as principled resistance to tyranny rather than simple thirst for stronger drink. Grudgingly, ship by ship, the fleet complied. Aboard at least one ship in Vernon's fleet, according to surviving muster and punishment records from the period, the order produced exactly the kind of quiet resistance you'd expect from men who felt something owed to them had been taken away without their consent. Sailors experimented, in the weeks after the order took hold, with every method available to recover what dilution had cost them. Hoarding the sugar meant to sweeten the mixture and trading it separately, attempting to skim off the strongest portion of a freshly mixed batch before it had time to blend evenly. And in at least a few documented disciplinary cases, smuggling small private stores of undiluted spirit aboard from shore leave, hidden in places an inspecting officer wouldn't easily think to search. None of it worked especially well, and punishment for smuggling liquor aboard, already a standing Royal Navy offence before Vernon's order, was enforced without much sympathy for the underlying grievance. What's notable, reading these records now, is how much energy went into resisting a change that, from a purely medical standpoint, was almost certainly making these same sailors measurably healthier, fewer falls from rigging, fewer botched orders, fewer floggable offences committed in a drunken haze that the sailor committing them barely remembered by morning. Nobody aboard those ships was thinking about long-term health outcomes, of course. They were thinking about the taste of their evening ration. And the taste, everyone agreed, had gotten considerably worse. It's the sailors themselves, in their grumbling, who accidentally coined one of the most enduring words in the English language. Vernon had a personal habit, well known throughout the fleet, of wearing a coat made of a coarse silk and wool fabric called grogram, particularly in damp weather, and sailors had already taken to calling him Old Grogram or Old Grog behind his back, the way sailors in every era invent nicknames for the officers who annoy them. When the watered-down ration arrived, sailors simply transferred the Admiral's own nickname onto the drink itself, calling it grog in open mockery of the man who'd diluted their rum. And the name stuck so completely that within a generation it had entirely displaced any more formal term, eventually working its way into ordinary English as a general word for watered spirits, and later still into the related word groggy, describing exactly the woozy, unsteady state that a sailor recovering from either too much grog or too little sleep or a blow to the head might experience. Vernon almost certainly never intended to invent a word. He intended to stop men falling out of rigging drunk. Language, characteristically, had other plans. The punishment records that survive from Vernon's own era give a sense of just how routinely drunkenness translated into physical suffering under Royal Navy discipline. In a way that makes the contrast with pirate practice sharper still, ship's logs and court-martial records from the mid-18th century Royal Navy document floggings a standard punishment delivered with a multi-tailed whip called a cato 9 tails across a sailor's bare back, sometimes numbering a dozen lashes, sometimes several dozen for repeated offences, handed down for offences that frequently traced directly back to drink, sleeping at a post. Insubordination toward an officer, fighting, theft committed while intoxicated. An officer decided the sentence. A sailor had no vote, no article to invoke, no quartermaster empowered to argue his case before the whole company. Only the hope that the captain reading his offence might show some measure of leniency that day. Compare that to the scene from earlier in this story, aboard a pirate ship with no admiral and no formal chain of command at all, where a dice dispute over rum got settled not by an officer's unilateral judgment, but by a crew-wide vote conducted in 20 minutes, with witnesses called and grievances actually heard. It's not that pirate justice was gentle. Marooning a man on a spit of sand with a pistol and a little powder was its own kind of brutal sentence, and it happened. But it happened by vote among equals rather than by decree from above, and that structural difference shaped how each system handled rum's dangers in genuinely different ways. Here's where the contrast with everything you've already followed through this story becomes worth sitting with directly. Pirate crews of exactly this same rough era, Tobias Fenwick's ship, Silas Grant's ship, the hundreds like them operating through the 1710s and 1720s, had no admiral, no fleet-wide order, and no central authority capable of mandating anything at all. And yet, through nothing more than elected quartermasters, written articles, and a functioning peer accountability system that punished drunkenness at the wrong moment while still protecting the daily ration as something close to a right, they had arrived, informally and without a single naval regulation ever being written, at roughly the same underlying solution the Royal Navy would only formalise decades later under threat of near mutiny, moderate, managed, fairly distributed drink, rather than either total prohibition or total excess. It's not that pirates were healthier or wiser than Royal Navy sailors as individuals. It's that a system where the men drinking the ration also had a direct, voted say in how it was managed turned out, almost by accident, to produce better outcomes than a rigid hierarchy where an admiral's cabin decided everything and a sailor's only recourse was grumbling. The science behind that 1795 Citrus edition deserves a moment of its own, because it's a genuinely remarkable piece of medical history that had nothing to do with Vernon and everything to do with a Scottish naval surgeon named James Lind, who conducted what's now widely regarded as one of the earliest controlled clinical trials in medical history aboard Ham Salisbury in 1747. Lind divided a group of scurvy-afflicted sailors into pairs, gave each pair a different proposed remedy, vinegar, seawater, cider, a citrus mixture of oranges and lemons, among others, and observed over the following days that the sailors given citrus recovered dramatically faster and more completely than any other group. It took the Admiralty nearly 50 years after Lind's results were published to act on them systematically, a delay that historians still find somewhat baffling given how clear his findings were. But by 1795, the connection between citrus and scurvy prevention had become impossible to ignore, and lemon juice, later lime juice, became a standard addition to every sailor's daily grog. Scurvy, which had killed sailors by the thousands across the age of sail. Some estimates suggest it claimed more Royal Navy lives during the 18th century than combat, storm and shipwreck combined, began, at last, to recede as a routine hazard of long voyages, and grog, mixed with citrus, became the accidental delivery vehicle for one of the most important public health discoveries of its century. Grog's story doesn't end with Vernon, and the next chapter of it matters enough to include here even though it happened decades after his order. In 1795, the Royal Navy's own physicians, following mounting evidence linking citrus consumption to the prevention of scurvy, the devastating vitamin C deficiency that had killed more sailors across the age of sail than combat, storm, and shipwreck combined, made lemon juice a mandatory addition to the daily grog ration, later switched to lime juice for supply reasons. A change so thorough and so visibly associated with British sailors that other nations, especially the Americans, began calling them limeys, a nickname that outlived the age of sail entirely and is still occasionally used today. Generations after anyone aboard a grog ration ship last drew breath. Grog's slow institutional decline wasn't limited to the size of the ration alone. The very ritual surrounding up spirits, the daily call that summoned crews to collect their measure, gradually accumulated its own layers of custom and superstition across the centuries, sailors developing informal rules about who poured first, how the mixture should be stirred, and which toasts were owed on which day of the week, a folk tradition built entirely on top of Vernon's original administrative order, the way barnacles accumulate on a hull left too long in warm water. None of it was mandated by any regulation. All of it mattered enormously to the men observing it, in exactly the way Tobias Fenwick's humming or Silas Grant's habit of checking a cask's seams mattered far more to their respective crews than any line written into a formal set of articles. The half-pint measure Vernon diluted in 1740 didn't stay fixed at that size forever, either, and tracing its slow shrinkage across the following 2 centuries tells its own quiet story about the Royal Navy's gradually changing relationship with the drink. The Admiralty tinkered with the exact mixing ratio too, not just the raw quantity. Vernon's original 1 part rum to 4 parts water blend shifted over the decades as naval administrators debated, with evident seriousness, exactly how weak a ration could get before it stopped serving its morale purpose entirely and simply became an insult dressed up as a beverage. By the mid-19th century, the daily ration had already been reduced from Vernon's original half-pint down to a quarter-pint per man, a cut driven partly by ongoing concerns about discipline and partly by simple cost, as the Admiralty's budget-conscious officials periodically revisited the question of exactly how much free spirit a global navy of tens of thousands of sailors truly needed to function. The temperance movements sweeping through Victorian Britain added their own pressure, framing the daily ration less as a harmless tradition and more as a moral hazard the Navy ought to be ashamed of continuing. Though the Admiralty, characteristically cautious about tampering with sailors' morale, resisted outright abolition for generations longer than the temperance societies would have liked. It's a slow, grinding institutional story, the kind that rarely makes it into popular retellings of naval history, but it matters here because it shows Vernon's 1740 order wasn't a single fixed moment so much as the opening move in a conversation the Royal Navy would keep having with itself, in fits and starts, for the better part of 230 years. The daily grog ration itself proved remarkably durable, surviving Vernon, surviving the Napoleonic Wars, surviving the transition from sail to steam, and continuing, in gradually reduced form, well into the 20th century, a fact worth holding on to, because it means this story isn't finished yet. There will be one more chapter to tell about grog, much later in this account, involving a considerably more recent date than anything discussed so far, and a ceremony aboard Royal Navy ships that, when it finally came, felt to more than one sailor present like watching an old friend go into the ground. For now, though, the relevant point is simpler, and a little rye, the same drink that pirate crews managed through vote and article, freely and informally, for the better part of a century, eventually had to be forced on the world's most disciplined navy through a formal admiral's order, mocked into a new word by the very sailors receiving it, and only made genuinely safe for long voyages after another half-century of accumulated medical evidence about citrus. Rum, it turns out, didn't need an admiral's authority to be managed responsibly. It needed people who actually had a stake in the outcome, which, on Vernon's ships, the ordinary sailor conspicuously did not. And on a pirate ship, by design, every single man did. Vernon himself never fully escaped the irony of what he'd started. He went on to a mixed and occasionally contentious later career, including a badly failed assault on Cartagena de Indias in 1741 that undid much of the goodwill Portobello had earned him, and he died in 1757, well before grog had fully calcified into ordinary English usage, meaning the admiral who accidentally gave the language one of its most durable words likely never fully grasped just how permanent his own mocking nickname was about to become. Sailors, it turns out, hold grudges with remarkable creativity and remarkable staying power. Edward Vernon commanded fleets, won a nation's brief adoration, and had an American founding father's estate named in his honour, and none of it has proven half as durable in the centuries since. As 4 exasperated syllables coined by exhausted men mocking his coat. It's a strange kind of immortality, achieved entirely by accident, and Vernon would likely have been equal parts amused and mortified to learn that his own name survives today far more often attached to a watered-down drink than to any of the battles he actually fought to win it. That difference in stake, who actually controls the ration and who merely receives it, turns out to matter for more than morale. It shows up again and again in how each kind of ship handled rum's genuine physical toll, and that toll on a pirate vessel especially could be considerably darker than a grumbling fleet mixing water into their cups. You wake up before your body's ready to, and the first thing you're aware of is the throb behind your eyes, a slow, steady pounding that matches your pulse almost exactly, like your own heartbeat has relocated itself directly into your skull sometime overnight. That's the ordinary cost of yesterday's celebration, the captured Dutch rum, the singing nobody remembered the words to, the general sense that for one evening the whole crew could simply stop counting casks and enjoy what was in them. This morning, counting casks is the last thing on your mind. Your mouth tastes like old rope. Your stomach rolls dangerously every time the ship pitches, which it does constantly, because the sea, unlike your body, did not take last night off. Around you, in the grey early light filtering down through the hatch, you can hear a chorus of groans from men in roughly the same condition, a few muttered curses, and somewhere toward the bow, the unmistakable sound of someone losing what little's left in his stomach over the rail. Here's the thing rum never advertises about itself. On this ship or any other, the comfort it offers in the evening always, without fail, comes due the next morning, and the bill doesn't discount for good company or a fair cause. The articles you signed back in Nassau don't punish this. A hangover isn't a crime, whatever it might feel like this particular morning, and every man aboard, including the captain, has woken up exactly like this more times than he'd care to count. What the articles do punish, in language read aloud and agreed to by every signature, including yours, is drunkenness at the wrong moment. Specifically, being found unfit for duty during an engagement, a chase, or any task the ship's safety depends on. It's a distinction that sounds simple until you actually live inside it, because rum doesn't come with a clock telling you when the next chase might begin, and more than one crew across this era has been caught badly unprepared, half its company still too drunk to properly load a gun, when a naval sloop or a hostile rival came over the horizon faster than anyone expected. You've heard the stories second-hand, the way you hear most things aboard ship, a crew surprised at anchor, cannon manned by men who could barely stand, taken or scattered before they'd sobered up enough to fight back properly. Nobody wants to be that story. Everybody, on some level, understands they could become it anyway. Within a year of signing the articles, you've watched the accumulating toll rum takes on a body up close, in ways that have nothing to do with any single bad night, and everything to do with sheer repetition. There's a name for what the ship's surgeon calls it when a man's belly swells and his legs turn heavy and waterlogged despite eating no more than anyone else: dropsy. An old and imprecise term for the fluid retention that chronic heavy drinking, combined with poor diet, can produce over months and years, a condition period medical writers already associated, correctly as it turns out, with sustained excessive drink. You've watched a topman 2 years your senior develop exactly that look, ankles gone thick and shiny tight, breath coming shorter each week, and you've watched him keep drinking his full ration every single day regardless. Because on a ship where rum is currency, comfort, and the one guaranteed pleasure in an otherwise brutal existence, telling a man to simply stop is easier said by someone who's never lived this particular life. There's a second, considerably more frightening toll that shows up less often but leaves a deeper mark on everyone who witnesses it, and you see it firsthand roughly 8 months into your time aboard, when a badly wounded man, laid up in the surgeon's makeshift sickbay recovering from a musket ball to the shoulder, goes several days without his usual ration while his fever's monitored, and begins on the 3rd day to shake uncontrollably, sweating through his blankets, muttering at things that aren't in the room, gripped by a terror that seems to come from nowhere at all. Whitfield recognises it immediately, even if he doesn't have the modern medical vocabulary for what you'd now call delirium tremens, the severe and occasionally fatal withdrawal reaction that can strike a body accustomed to heavy daily drink when that drink is suddenly and completely removed. His solution, crude by any modern standard but grounded in genuine period medical understanding, is to reintroduce a small, carefully measured dose of rum rather than withhold it further, tapering the man down gradually over the following week rather than cutting him off outright. It works, more or less, the shaking eases, the muttering stops, and within 10 days the man's back on light duty, pale and hollowed out, but alive. Whitfield tells you afterward, in his flat, tired way, that he's seen it kill men before, on other ships, under other surgeons, who didn't understand what they were looking at, and simply let a wounded man go dry out of some misguided notion that abstinence would speed his recovery. It's a strange, uncomfortable truth to sit with, that on a ship where rum caused so much visible harm, it was also, in this one specific and well-documented way, sometimes the only thing standing between a sick man and a considerably worse death. The surgeon himself, a stooped, soft-spoken man everyone calls Dr. Whitfield, though nobody's entirely sure the title is genuine, rather than simply granted by a crew desperate to believe someone aboard has real medical training, is not exempt from any of what he treats in others. You notice, within your first month under his care for a minor gash across your forearm, that his own hands shake faintly in the mornings before his own ration arrives, steadying noticeably within the hour after, and you understand, without either of you ever discussing it directly, that whatever training brought him to this trade, whatever circumstance stranded him aboard a pirate ship rather than a respectable practice ashore, rum has become as necessary to his own daily function as it has to nearly everyone else's. He's good at his work regardless, steady-handed with a needle once the morning shakes pass, patient with frightened men, honest in a trade that rewards very little honesty. And there's something quietly moving about watching a man manage his own affliction well enough to keep other men alive, even while it's slowly working against him too. 3 weeks after you first notice the tremor, Whitfield tells you, unprompted, over a shared cup one quiet evening, about a case from an earlier voyage that's clearly stayed with him. A young hand, barely past his first year at sea, drank his full ration plus a friend's, unwisely wagered and won during an evening's dice game, and stumbled toward the rail sometime after midnight to relieve himself, alone, in rough water nobody thought worth waking the watch over. Nobody saw him go over. He simply wasn't there at muster the next morning, and by the time anyone thought to search, there was nothing left to find, no cry heard, no splash noticed over the ordinary sounds of a ship at night. Just an empty space in the muster line where a name had been the day before. It's the kind of death that surviving trial depositions from captured pirate crews actually do document. Sailors and pirates alike lost overboard drunk in the dark, a mundane, unglamorous, entirely preventable kind of dying that never makes it into the popular legend of this era, which prefers its pirate death's dramatic cannon fire, the noose, a captain's last stand. This one was none of those things. It was simply a man, a rail, and too much rum on a rolling deck at night, and Whitfield tells it flat, without embellishment. In a voice that makes clear he's told himself this exact story more than once, trying to extract some lesson from it he can actually use. The topman with the swollen ankles has a name, and it's worth using it here rather than leaving him as an anonymous cautionary detail, because his slow decline over the following months becomes one of the quieter griefs of your time aboard. He's called Ezra Wren, older than most of the crew by a decade or more. a veteran of enough voyages that younger hands, yourself included, generally defer to his judgment on matters of seamanship without question. Wren doesn't drink more than his fair ration. Not really. He's no Aldous Price, gambling away tomorrow's cup or hoarding a private stash. He simply drinks his full, fair, honestly earned share every single day, for years, aboard ship after ship, in a body that slowly stopped processing it the way it once did. And there's no article, no vote, no quartermaster's fair distribution that can protect a man from the accumulated weight of an entirely ordinary ration taken consistently over an entire working life at sea. Whitfield watches him with quiet, professional concern that never quite tips into intervention. Because what would intervention even look like? On a ship where the daily ration is treated as close to a sacred right, for a man who's never once been drunk on duty or endangered anyone but, slowly, unmistakably, himself. Wren dies not aboard your ship, but the one after it. You learn much later, second-hand, from a sailor who served alongside him at the end, quietly in his hammock, of causes nobody aboard had the medical vocabulary to properly name, though everyone who'd sailed with him for any length of time understood well enough what had actually taken him. It's not a dramatic death. It doesn't make for a good tavern story. But it's the single most common way rum actually killed the men who drank it across this entire era, far more often than gunpowder and rum legends or drunken falls from rigging, not in a single reckless night, but in the patient, honest, fully earned accumulation of an entirely ordinary daily ration, taken fairly, for years, until a body simply couldn't carry it any further. There's a persistent belief aboard this ship, and apparently aboard most others of the era, that rum itself offers some protection against the diseases that plague long voyages, a belief Whitfield, to his credit, works hard to correct whenever the subject comes up, though not always successfully against a century of accumulated folk wisdom. Scurvy, the vitamin deficiency disease that causes bleeding gums, loosened teeth, and eventually death across long stretches without fresh fruit or vegetables, has nothing whatsoever to do with rum. One way or the other, a fact modern nutritional science confirms completely, but 18th century sailors, lacking any understanding of vitamins at all, sometimes convinced themselves that a stronger daily ration might ward off whatever mysterious cause lay behind the disease. It doesn't. If anything, rum's tendency to suppress appetite and displace whatever meagre nutrition was available in salted meat and hardtack likely made matters marginally worse for men already teetering on the edge of malnutrition, though nobody aboard this ship has the scientific framework available to understand that connection yet. Whitfield simply insists, patiently and repeatedly, that any man showing early signs of loosening teeth or unusual bruising needs whatever citrus or fresh provisions can be found, rum ration or no rum ration. And slowly, unevenly, some of the crew has started listening to him. You watch the discipline side of this toll play out directly 6 weeks later, when a gunner named Aldous Price is found so thoroughly drunk during a tense standoff with a suspicious sail on the horizon that he can't properly prime his own gun, fumbling the powder badly enough that another hand has to step in and finish the job for him, while the whole crew watches the strange ship, uncertain where the battle is about to begin. It doesn't. In the end, the other vessel turns out to be a harmless trader, giving your ship a wide, wary berth rather than approaching. But the close call is enough to trigger exactly the article you signed back in Nassau, and the whole company gathers to vote on Price's punishment the following morning. It's a genuinely documented practice among pirate crews of this era that marooning, while rare, absolutely happened, and happened specifically for offences like this one, endangering the whole ship through drunken incompetence at a critical moment. The vote, when it comes, doesn't go that far. Price gets a formal flogging instead, and a public dressing down from the quartermaster in front of the assembled crew, and a reduced ration for a fortnight as a further reminder. It's harsh. It's also, by the standards of naval discipline in this same era, considerably more restrained than what an officer's unilateral judgment might have produced. And Price, humiliated but alive and still aboard, takes the lesson seriously enough that you never see him repeat the mistake. By the time your ship approaches its next major engagement, a genuine fight against a well-armed merchant escort several months later, something has visibly shifted in how the crew handles the ration, and it's worth noting because it complicates any simple story about pirates and drink. Word passes quietly through the ship the evening before, not from any formal order, but from the accumulated, unspoken understanding of men who've watched Price's near disaster and Whitfield's drowned patient, and the topman's swollen ankles all pile up in recent memory. Tonight, the ration stays light, voluntarily, no article required, because everyone aboard understands what tomorrow demands of clear hands and steady aim. Fenwick or Grant or whichever quartermaster happens to be pouring on your particular ship doesn't have to enforce a thing. The crew enforces it on themselves, quietly, without ceremony, the same rough democratic instinct that governs everything else about this life extending itself, for one important night, to restraint rather than indulgence. That's the part of this chapter worth sitting with as it closes, because it would be easy, given everything you've just seen, the drowned sailor, the swollen ankles, the trembling surgeon, the near-disastrous gunner, to conclude that rum was simply a slow poison this life inflicted on everyone who touched it. It wasn't only that, and reducing it to only that would flatten something more complicated and, in its own strange way, more hopeful. The same men who drank themselves into genuine danger were also the men who, given a vote and a stake in the outcome, chose restraint on the one night it mattered most, without needing an admiral's order or a flogging to convince them. Whitfield keeps treating the crew with shaking morning hands that steady by midday. Price keeps his post, chastened but trusted again within weeks. And somewhere below, a name that used to answer at muster stays permanently absent, a quiet reminder of the cost this drink could exact from a life that already offered so little room for error. Whitfield keeps a small private tally of his own, separate from anything Fenwick or Grant might chalk onto a slate elsewhere in this account. A running mental accounting, never written down, of every man he's treated for a drink-related injury or illness, across his years at sea, a number he mentions to you only once, in passing, late one evening, before quickly changing the subject, as though saying it aloud made it more real than he wanted it to be. You never learn the exact figure. You suspect, watching his face in the moment he almost tells you, that it's larger than he'd like anyone aboard to know, including himself. Violence between crewmates, when it happens at all aboard a well-run ship, traces back to rum more often than to any other single cause, and you see a mild version of it yourself in your 10th month, when two normally amiable hands come to blows over an imagined slight, neither one able to properly recall the next morning what had actually started the argument. It's minor, as these things go, bruised knuckles, a split lip, both men shamefaced and apologetic once the rum wears off enough for either to think clearly, but Whitfield treats the aftermath with the same weary patience he brings to every other rum-related injury this life produces, stitching the split lip while delivering. Not for the first time. A quiet lecture neither man is in any condition to fully absorb. The articles have a clause for exactly this too, distinguishing between blows struck in genuine mutiny or theft, which carry serious penalties, and blows struck in ordinary drunken foolishness, which typically earn nothing worse than the humiliation of the whole crew knowing about it by breakfast. It's a small mercy, built into the written rules of a life that shows very few mercies elsewhere, and it reflects something true about how this particular community understood its own worst habit, not as a moral failing to be punished harshly, but as an ordinary, predictable cost of the life everyone had chosen, to be managed with as much fairness as the circumstances allowed. You think about Ezra Wren often in the weeks after word of his death reaches your ship, more often than you'd expected to think about a man you'd known for less than a year. What stays with you isn't the manner of his dying, which was, as these things went, about as gentle as this life allowed. It's a small memory from early in your time aboard, a becalmed evening not unlike the one you weathered with Fenwick and the dice game, when Wren spent the better part of an hour teaching a frightened, seasick boy barely 12 years old pressed into service as a powder monkey off a captured merchantman, homesick and miserable in a way none of the older hands quite knew how to address, how to read the set of the clouds for coming weather, patient in a way his gruff daily manner never quite suggested he had in him. The boy went on, you heard later, to make a genuinely fine sailor, and some part of that owed itself to an old topman with failing ankles who took an evening he didn't have to spare and spent it on a child who wasn't his responsibility. Rum took a great deal from Ezra Wren over the years. It's worth remembering, in the same breath, that Ezra Wren gave a great deal too, right up until the very end, and that the ledger between those two facts was never as simple as a single cause of death could suggest. Not every pirate who drank himself into legend went quietly, the way Wren did. Some went out as loudly as it was possible for a human being to go, in a blaze of gunfire and gunpowder-laced rumour that outlived the men themselves by 3 centuries and counting. And there's no better place to see exactly how tangled fact and legend become around this drink than in the story of the most famous pirate who ever lived, a man whose name still conjures smoke, fire, and a beard that, according to legend, he set alight before battle just to terrify the men he was about to fight. The morning of November 22nd, 1718, breaks grey and still over Ocracoke Inlet, a shallow sand-barred passage along the Carolina coast, and aboard a modest sloop called the Adventure, a heavy-set man with a famously black, elaborately braided beard is drinking, by more than one account written down not long afterward. Something considerably stronger than his morning ration. 2 Royal Navy sloops, the Jane and the Ranger, are closing on his position under the command of a lieutenant named Robert Maynard, dispatched by Virginia's governor with clear orders and a bounty on the black-bearded man's head. Within a few hours, one of the most famous fights in pirate history will end with that head separated from its body, hung from the bowsprit of Maynard's own ship as proof for a governor who wanted to see it for himself. Before any of that happens, though, this is a story worth telling from the beginning, because almost nothing about the man history remembers as Blackbeard arrived at that final morning by accident. His origins remain genuinely uncertain, a fact worth stating plainly rather than papering over with false confidence. Most modern historians believe he was born Edward Teach, or possibly Thatch. Spelling and surviving records is inconsistent enough that even his own name resists certainty, likely somewhere in England, possibly Bristol, sometime around 1680, though no baptismal record or other document has ever been definitively matched to him. What's better documented is his emergence into recorded history around 1716 and 1717, serving first under an established pirate captain named Benjamin Hornigold, operating out of the Bahamas, before striking out with his own command. That command became considerably more formidable in November of 1717, when Teach's crew captured a French slave ship called La Concorde off the island of Martinique, a vessel originally built for the brutal Atlantic slave trade, carrying dozens of enslaved Africans at the time of her capture. Teach refitted her, fitted her with as many as 40 guns by some estimates, and renamed her Queen Anne's Revenge, transforming what had been an instrument of one horror into, arguably, an instrument of another, a ship that would carry his reputation to its most fearsome height over the following year. By the spring of 1718, that reputation had grown formidable enough that Teach felt confident attempting something few pirates of this era dared, blockading an entire American port city. In May of that year, he anchored a small fleet, Queen Anne's Revenge among them, at the mouth of Charleston Harbour in the colony of South Carolina, and over roughly a week, stopped and searched vessels attempting to enter or leave the port, taking hostages from among the passengers, including, according to colonial records from the period, a member of the governor's own council. His demand was unusual for a pirate captain of this era, and worth noting because it complicates the simpler image of piracy as pure plunder, rather than ransom money alone. Teach demanded a chest of medicine, specifically valuable and hard-to-obtain supplies, to treat what was likely a case of venereal disease spreading among his own crew, a detail preserved in colonial governor Robert Johnson's own correspondence describing the blockade to his superiors back in London. Charleston, its harbour effectively strangled and its prominent citizens, held hostage, complied, and Teach released his captives once the medicine chest arrived, sailing away having demonstrated briefly and dramatically that a single pirate captain could bring one of England's wealthiest colonial ports to its knees. Not long after the Charleston blockade, in June of 1718, Queen Anne's Revenge ran aground and broke apart on a sandbar near Beaufort Inlet, North Carolina, an event some historians have long suspected wasn't purely accidental, given that Teach used the wreck as an opportunity to maroon a significant portion of his crew on a small nearby island, reducing his company and, not incidentally, reducing the number of men who'd expect an equal share of the considerable plunder he'd accumulated. Whether that reading is accurate or simply a later embellishment is, like so much about this man, genuinely disputed among historians working from incomplete records. What's certain is that Teach, with a much smaller remaining crew, soon after accepted a royal pardon being offered at the time to pirates willing to renounce their trade, presenting himself to North Carolina's governor, Charles Eden, and settling, for a period of months, into something approaching respectable colonial life in the small town of Bath. That period of apparent retirement is one of the more genuinely strange chapters in his story, and it complicates the popular image of Blackbeard as a man who knew only violence. Surviving colonial records suggest he married during this period a woman named Mary Ormond. By some accounts, though the details of this marriage, like so much else, rest on sources of uncertain reliability, and lived for a time as an ordinary, if famous, resident of Bath, on apparently cordial terms with Governor Eden himself, terms cordial enough that later investigations raised serious suspicion Eden may have quietly profited from continuing to shelter and do business with his supposedly reformed pirate neighbour. It didn't last. Within months, Teach was back at sea, back to raiding, whether from restlessness, financial pressure, the pull of a trade he genuinely preferred to any other life available to him, or some combination none of the surviving records can fully explain. It's around this same general period, according to the single most influential and least verifiable source on Blackbeard's life, that the drink this chapter is ultimately about enters his legend directly, in the form of one of the most famous and most disputed anecdotes in all of pirate history. Captain Charles Johnson's 1724 General History of the Pirates, the same source. Discussed earlier in this account, whose authorship remains debated, and whose reliability historians have long questioned, describes Teach on at least one documented as legend occasion, mixing gunpowder directly into a bowl of rum, setting it alight and drinking the flaming concoction alongside his crew in a dim, sealed hold, an act framed as a kind of hellish endurance contest, meant to prove which men aboard could stomach hell itself before facing it in truth. It's a vivid, unforgettable image, and it's exactly the kind of theatrical, larger-than-life detail Johnson's book specialises in, which is precisely why it deserves the same, according to legend caution applied throughout this account to anything traceable to that single source. No independent record, no trial deposition, no colonial correspondence, no ship's log. Corroborates the gunpowder rum story, and modern historians generally treat it as exactly what it reads like, a piece of dramatic flourish, whether invented outright by Johnson or exaggerated from some smaller, less theatrical kernel of actual behaviour, designed to cement an image of a man who welcomed his own damnation rather than feared it. Whether Teach ever actually drank flaming gunpowder-laced rum in a sealed hold is quite simply impossible to verify. That the story took hold so completely and has been repeated so often in the 3 centuries since tells you a great deal about what this drink had come to represent by the time Blackbeard's legend was being written down, no longer simply a comfort or a currency, but a prop in its own theatre of fear. What's better documented, and considerably more useful for understanding the actual man rather than the legend built around him, is how Teach managed his crew day to day, and here the record intersects meaningfully with everything already established in this story about Rum's role aboard a working pirate ship. Surviving accounts, including testimony from men captured alongside him or who'd served under him and later gave depositions to colonial authorities, describe a captain who understood, as every successful pirate captain of this era had to, that a crew's loyalty required more than fear of the black flag flying overhead. Rum featured prominently in that management, doled out generously enough to keep morale high through the long stretches of monotony that made up most of even Blackbeard's dramatic career, managed through the same rough system of quartermasters and shared risk that governed every other ship in this account. The theatrical, gunpowder-drinking legend obscures a considerably more ordinary and, in its way, more impressive truth that Edward Teach held together one of the most feared crews of his era, not primarily through terror, but through the same unglamorous machinery of fair shares, managed rations, and voted on articles that kept crews functioning across the entire Golden Age of Piracy. The reputation Teach cultivated, deliberately and with evident showmanship, worked in his favour for most of his career precisely because it meant fewer ships resisted him at all. Contemporary and near-contemporary accounts describe him weaving lit slow-match fuses into his beard before an engagement, letting the smoke curl up around his face to create an impression, from a distance, of a man wreathed in his own personal hellfire, a documented tactic. Distinct from the more theatrical gunpowder rum story that multiple independent sources describe with enough consistency to treat as more reliably historical. Combined with his sheer physical size, his famously loud voice, and a general willingness to let his terrifying reputation do the fighting a genuine battle might otherwise require. Teach spent much of his career taking prizes that simply surrendered rather than risk facing him directly, a strategy that required remarkably little actual violence to sustain, whatever the legend built up around him afterward might suggest. That strategy failed him, finally and permanently, on the morning this chapter opened with. Virginia's governor, Alexander Spotswood, alarmed by reports that Teach's supposedly reformed piracy was continuing under Governor Eden's apparent protection in neighbouring North Carolina, dispatched Lieutenant Robert Menard with 2 hired sloops to hunt Teach down directly. Operating in a legal grey zone since Virginia's authority didn't technically extend into North Carolina's waters, Maynard found him at Ocracoke Inlet on November 21st, and the 2 sides spent the evening watching each other across the shallow water, Teach reportedly spending part of that final night drinking with a captured merchant captain aboard his own sloop. According to that same captain's later deposition, one of the more reliably documented details of Teach's final hours, since it comes from a witness who survived to testify rather than from Johnson's embellished retelling. The battle itself began the following morning when Maynard's sloops, navigating carefully around the treacherous sandbars, closed to engage. Teach's own vessel, lighter and more familiar with the local shallows, initially got the better of the exchange, one of Maynard's sloops taking heavy casualties from a devastating close-range broadside. But Maynard pressed the attack, and the fighting turned to close-quarters combat on Teach's own deck, cutlass and pistol at point-blank range, a brutal melee that period accounts, including Maynard's own official report to Governor Spotswood, describe in vivid and largely credible detail, since Maynard had every professional incentive to document his victory accurately for his superiors. Teach fought, by every surviving account of the battle's final minutes, with genuine and considerable ferocity, reportedly sustaining numerous wounds. Maynard's own report describes more than 20 separate cuts and gunshot wounds by the time he finally fell, before finally going down. Maynard had his men decapitate the body, hanging Teach's head from the bowsprit of his own sloop as proof of the kill for Governor Spotswood, and, not incidentally, as grim advertisement to any other pirate crew who might consider testing Virginia's resolve. It's a brutal, unambiguous end, documented well enough across multiple independent sources that historians treat the core facts of the battle and its immediate aftermath as reliably established, unlike so much else about Teach's life. The legend, naturally, didn't stop where the historical record does. Within years of his death, stories had already begun circulating, recorded, inevitably. In Johnson's general history, alongside everything else, describing Teach's headless body swimming several times around Maynard's ship before finally sinking beneath the waves, a piece of folklore that says everything about how thoroughly this one man's reputation had outgrown the ordinary bounds of a documented human life. and nothing whatsoever about anything that plausibly happened in the actual water off Ocracoke that morning. It belongs in the same category as the flaming gunpowder rum, a story too vivid and too useful, as a lesson about the terror Blackbeard supposedly commanded even in death, for anyone retelling it across the following 3 centuries to bother questioning too closely. This then is the story of Blackbeard, the pirate whose legend was built, in roughly equal measure, from documented ruthlessness, genuine tactical showmanship, and a set of vivid, largely unverifiable anecdotes involving rum, fire and fear, all of it filtered through a single dramatised 1724 book that shaped how English readers, and every generation since, would picture not just this one man, but the entire era of piracy he came, fairly or not, to represent. Strip away the flaming bowl of gunpowder-laced rum, and you're left with something almost more interesting. A captain who understood as thoroughly as any figure in this account that managing a crew's loyalty through fair shares and a well-run rum ration mattered considerably more, day to day, than any single theatrical stunt, and a man whose actual final morning, fighting with more than 20 wounds rather than drinking flaming spirits in a sealed hold, needed no embellishment at all to earn its place in history. Life in Bath during those retired months, brief as it was, has left a few small human-scale details in the colonial record worth including alongside the grander story of blockades and battles, because they complicate the image of a man who existed only as legend and violence. Bath in 1718 was a tiny settlement, barely a town by the standards of larger colonial ports, and Teach's presence there, a famous, wealthy, and by most accounts perfectly courteous neighbour during this period, reportedly made him a popular guest at local gatherings, entertaining fellow residents with stories of his voyages over shared drink in a manner colonial correspondence describes as genuinely sociable rather than menacing. It's a strange, almost domestic image to hold alongside everything else in this chapter. The same man whose name would terrify sailors up and down the American coast spending an ordinary evening in a small Carolina settlement, cup in hand, apparently enjoying himself among neighbours who had no particular reason to fear him, at least for as long as the pardon and the retirement both held. At the height of his power in the spring of 1718, Teach commanded a genuinely formidable force by the standards of Golden Age piracy. Queen Anne's Revenge alone reportedly carried as many as 40 guns, an armament that would have made her a match for most naval vessels operating in American waters at the time, crewed by several hundred men across his small fleet of accompanying sloops. A scale of operation that dwarfed most single-ship pirate crews of the era, including every vessel followed elsewhere in this account. Managing a company that size required exactly the kind of logistical discipline this story has already traced through smaller ships, quartermasters, rationing, a functioning system for dividing plunder fairly enough to prevent the whole unwieldy operation from splintering under its own size. Archaeological excavation of the wreck site off Beaufort Inlet, ongoing since its rediscovery in 1996 and continuing in the decades since, has recovered cannon, navigational instruments, and a considerable quantity of ship stores, physical evidence that while it can't speak to the flaming rum legend one way or the other, confirms the basic picture of a well-equipped, seriously provisioned vessel, rather than the ramshackle Operation Popular Imagination. Sometimes pictures. The aftermath of Teach's death extended well beyond the single dramatic morning at Ocracoke, and it's worth including here because it shows how thoroughly authorities of the period wanted his story to end as a lesson rather than simply a battle. Several of Teach's surviving crew members, captured during or shortly after the engagement, were transported to Williamsburg, Virginia, and tried for piracy, with more than a dozen ultimately executed by hanging, a grim coda that made unmistakably clear to any observer exactly what fate awaited men who continued sailing under a black flag after the pardons had already been offered and, in Teach's own case, already once accepted and abandoned. Governor Spotswood, for his part, claimed the bounty and considerable credit for ridding Virginia's waters of its most notorious threat, though the legal irregularity of dispatching Maynard into North Carolina's jurisdiction without clear authority caused enough friction with Governor Eden's administration that the political fallout lingered for years afterward, entangled with those same lingering suspicions that Eden had profited more from his supposedly reformed neighbour than any governor ought comfortably to admit. There's a quieter kind of wonder worth sitting with here before this chapter closes, separate from the violence and the legend both. Whatever else Edward Teach was, and the honest record suggests a genuinely brutal, calculating man who built a career on terror as much as skill, the crew who served under him for those final months at Ocracoke stayed with him, by every account. Right through that final battle, when the pardon he'd already once accepted would have let every one of them simply walk away. Something held them there beyond fear of their captain's reputation alone, whether it was loyalty, habit, shared risk, or simply nowhere better to go. It's worth remembering that even history's most theatrically terrifying pirate captain ultimately depended on the same fragile, human bonds of trust and shared fate that held together every ordinary crew in this account. Bonds that a fair rum ration, a voted set of articles, and an honestly kept tally slate did more to secure, in the end, than any amount of smoke curling through a braided beard. 3 centuries later, tourists still visit Ocracoke's quiet inlet, and gift shops up and down the North Carolina coast still sell bottles of spiced rum bearing his likeness on the label. A strange kind of immortality for a man whose actual final morning was considerably bloodier and considerably more human than any of it lets on. Local historians in the small town nearest the inlet still point visitors toward the approximate stretch of water where Maynard's sloops closed in, a spot marked today by nothing more dramatic than an informational plaque and the same shallow, unremarkable tide that's been rolling in and out of that inlet since long before Edward Teach or anyone resembling him ever sailed into it. There's a moment on the wind before you actually see Nassau Harbour, a shift in the air that every experienced hand aboard your ship seems to notice half an hour before you do, and it's not the smell of land, generally, which carries plenty far out at sea already. It's rum, specifically, drifting out across the water from a settlement that by 1717 has become something genuinely unprecedented in the Atlantic world, a town run in every practical sense by pirates themselves, with no royal governor holding effective authority over it, no customs house collecting duties anyone actually pays, and a harbour so thick with masts, many of them belonging to ships whose captains would be hanged on sight in any properly administered English port. That finding an anchorage takes your own vessel the better part of an hour. You come ashore into a scene that period accounts, including letters from horrified colonial officials writing to London, describe with a mixture of fascination and alarm. The beach itself is littered with the wrecks and stripped hulks of ships that never made it back out, salvaged for parts, timber, and fittings by a population that treats a grounded vessel less as a tragedy and more as a convenient source of building material. Rough wooden structures, some barely more than tents, others surprisingly substantial, line what passes for streets, and nearly every third one, by your rough count as you walk further in, appears to be some manner of drinking establishment, a density of taverns that would be remarkable in a city 10 times Nassau's size, let alone a settlement of a few thousand souls clinging to the edge of a Bahamian island with no formal government at all. Chickens and the occasional stray goat wander freely between the structures. Market stalls sell goods of obviously plundered origin alongside legitimate provisions, with no visible distinction drawn between the two. And the whole settlement carries an improvised half-finished quality, as though everyone living here has, on some level, understood from the beginning that none of it was built to last, and has simply declined to invest more effort in permanence than the moment strictly requires. The rum house you eventually settle into, recommended by an older hand from your ship who's clearly visited before, is run by a broad, weathered woman everyone simply calls Mother Cadence, a widow, by her own occasionally offered account, of a merchant captain lost years back to a hurricane, who took what little he'd left her and turned it, with evident shrewdness, into one of the more reliably stocked establishments on the whole waterfront. She keeps a slate behind her makeshift bar, not unlike the ones Fenwick and Grant kept aboard ship, tallying credit for men she trusts to pay once their next prize comes in. a system that works, by her own dry explanation, because a pirate who stiffs Mother Cadence quickly finds himself unwelcome in every other rum house on the beach too. Word travelling fast in a town this size regardless of how lawless it otherwise runs. It's a small, almost domestic irony worth noting. The most lawless port in the Atlantic world still runs, at the level of an individual tavern keeper's ledger, on exactly the same rough trust-based economy that governs every ship anchored in her harbour. Prices here run considerably lower than you'd find in any properly administered colonial port, a direct consequence of Nassau's total absence of customs duties or royal taxation, and it shows in how freely rum flows, even among men who arrived with modest shares from their last voyage. A cup that might cost several pence in Charleston or Boston, once colonial import duties and a legitimate merchant's markup are factored in, runs a fraction of that here, smuggled or locally distilled rum arriving untaxed and largely unregulated. Which means a pirate with even a middling share of recent plunder can drink comfortably for weeks before his coin runs genuinely short. Mother Cadence herself buys much of her stock from small local traders who ask no questions about origin, a supply chain built entirely on the same rough trust that governs everything else in this town, and she prices accordingly, undercutting anything a legitimate colonial tavern could realistically offer. It's one of the quieter, less romantic reasons Nassau became the haven it did, not simply lawlessness for its own sake, but lawlessness that happened to make one of the era's most desired commodities remarkably, wonderfully cheap. The names moving through Mother Cadence's rum house during your stay read, in hindsight, like a roll call of the era's most notorious figures, though at the time they're simply regulars. Familiar faces nodding to the tavern keeper and calling for their usual pour like anyone else. You catch sight of Charles Vane one evening, a captain with a reputation, even among other pirates, for a particularly hot temper and a stubborn unwillingness to consider any pardon at all, arguing loudly with another captain over harbour rights to a favoured anchorage. A dispute that nearly turns physical before Mother Cadence herself steps between them with the flat, practised authority of a woman who's broken up worse fights than this one and has no intention of losing good furniture to it tonight. On another evening, word passes through the room that Blackbeard himself, not yet at the height of the fame that would eventually carry him to Ocracoke, has put in briefly at the harbour before sailing on, though you never actually lay eyes on him yourself, his presence more rumour and ripple through the crowd than anything you can personally confirm. It's a strange thing, sitting in the middle of a moment historians would spend the next 3 centuries writing about, and understanding none of it feels historic while you're actually living inside it. It just feels like an unusually crowded, unusually loud rum house on an unusually hot Bahamian evening, filled with men whose names will outlive every one of them by a considerable margin, none of whom seem especially aware of that fact themselves. The gambling that fills most evenings here runs considerably higher stakes than anything you saw shipboard, freed from the confines of a single ship's limited stores and limited company. Cards, dice, and the occasional cockfight staged in a cleared patch of sand behind the tavern draw crowds willing to wager entire shares of recent plunder on a single hand or a single bird, and you watch, over the course of your stay, more than one man lose in an evening what took him months at sea to earn, taking the loss with the same rough fatalistic humour that seems to govern so much of this life. Disputes over these games get settled the same way the harbour rights argument nearly turned violent, loud, immediate, and usually resolved through appeal to whichever senior captains happen to be present rather than any formal authority, since none exists to appeal to. It's a rough justice, prone to favouring whoever commands the most respect or the most obviously armed friends in the room. But it's also, by more than one visiting merchant's grudging account from the period, considerably more orderly than the popular imagination of pirate lawlessness tends to suggest. A community that had, out of pure practical necessity, worked out its own rough rules for keeping several thousand armed, dangerous men from simply tearing the whole settlement apart over card games and cockfights. By your second evening in Mother Cadence's establishment, you've watched at least one dispute settled the way disputes tend to get settled in a town with no magistrate, no sheriff, and no jail, by loud argument, by appeal to whichever senior respected pirate captains happened to be present and willing to arbitrate, and, failing that, by the same rough dice and cards gambling culture that governs so much of shipboard life, extended here onto dry land with considerably higher stakes available. Nassau in this period operates under something historians have taken to calling, with only slight exaggeration, a pirate republic. A loose, informal governing arrangement among the town's most prominent captains, with a pirate named Benjamin Hornigold, and later others, holding an unofficial title some contemporary accounts describe as a kind of commodore or senior arbiter, empowered by rough consensus rather than any royal commission to settle disputes between crews and maintain enough order that the whole operation didn't collapse into open warfare between rival captains competing for the same harbour. Space. There's no throne here, no formal seat of power, nothing resembling the trappings of ordinary colonial government, just a rough improvised consensus, renegotiated constantly, among men who'd hanged for treason in any other port simply for the flags they flew. It's a genuinely fascinating historical curiosity, this brief window of pirate self-governance, and it lasted, in its fullest form, for barely 3 or 4 years before the world outside Nassau's harbour caught up with it. That world starts closing in during your stay, and the tension is impossible to miss even for a newcomer like yourself. One young man in particular, a forced recruit barely older than you are yourself, becomes something of a fixture at Mother Cadence's bar during those final uncertain weeks, and his situation puts a human face on the choice hanging over the entire town. His name is Josiah Kent, pressed into pirate service off a merchantman less than a year back, never having fully reconciled himself to the trade he'd been forced into, even as he's grown reasonably skilled at it, out of sheer necessity. The pardon, when word of Roger's imminent arrival finally solidifies into certainty rather than rumour, represents something Kent has apparently been quietly hoping for since the day he signed the articles under duress. A legitimate way out, official forgiveness for a life he never chose in the first place, a chance to sail home, or somewhere like it, without a rope waiting for him at the end of the voyage. You watch him agonise over it anyway, because the pardon, however welcome, comes with its own uncertainties, no guarantee of a merchant berth waiting for a young man with a year's piracy on his record, even if that record's technically forgiven, no certainty that the coin he's accumulated under the articles will translate cleanly into a legitimate life ashore, and a genuine fear, voiced quietly to you over a shared cup one evening, that some captains accepting the pardon are already being quietly watched and eventually rearrested on older charges the Crown never formally forgave. Mother Cadence, overhearing more of this conversation than either of you probably realised, offers Kent the same blunt, practical wisdom she's clearly dispensed to dozens of uncertain young men before him, that no choice available to him is entirely safe, that the pardon is imperfect but real, and that a young man with his whole life still ahead of him owes it to that life to take the safer, imperfect option over the more dangerous familiar one. Kent takes the pardon, in the end one of the hundreds who do, and the last you see of him is a brief awkward handshake on the beach before he boards a ship bound, he hopes, towards something resembling an ordinary life. You never learn whether he found it. Not every thread in a story this size gets tied off neatly, and Nassau in the summer of 1718 produces hundreds of stories exactly like his, most of them destined to simply vanish from the record the moment their subjects stepped off that beach and out of anyone's notice. Word arrives, carried by a merchant captain who stops in Mother Cadence's establishment for a drink and, evidently, a bit of gossip, that the English Crown has issued a formal act of grace, offering pardon to any pirate who surrenders and renounces the trade before a set deadline, an offer first proclaimed in September of 1717 and set to expire the following September. It's not the first such pardon offer of the era, and more than a few hardened men in Mother Cadence's establishment scoff openly at the idea, having heard similar promises before that dissolved into betrayal or simply proved impossible to actually collect on from an island with no functioning colonial administration to process the paperwork. But the mood shifts, subtly but unmistakably, over the following weeks of your stay, as more and more captains begin openly discussing whether this offer, unlike previous ones, might actually be genuine, and whether Nassau's improbable run as a lawless haven might finally be reaching its natural end. Mother Cadence herself has an opinion on the matter, delivered to you one quiet evening when the rum house is mostly empty and she's got a moment to lean against her own bar rather than working it. She's watched captains and crews come and go for years now, she tells you, watched fortunes made and lost across her own slate, and she's under no illusion that Nassau's freedom, real as it feels while you're standing in the middle of it, was ever going to last indefinitely. A town with no taxes, no governor, and no law beyond what a rough council of pirate captains chooses to enforce is, by its very nature, an affront to every colonial power with ships and money enough to eventually do something about it. And England, she says flatly, has both in considerable supply. It's a sobering thing to hear from a woman who's built her entire livelihood on exactly the freedom she's now predicting won't survive much longer, and there's a weariness in how she says it that suggests she's made her peace with the ending before it's even fully arrived. The ending, when it comes, arrives in the summer of 1718 in the considerable person of Woodes Rogers, a former privateer and genuinely capable naval commander appointed by the Crown as Nassau's first royal governor, arriving in late July with a small fleet, a formal commission, an explicit authority to offer the king's pardon in person, while backing it with enough naval force to make refusal a considerably less appealing option than it had been when the offer existed only as distant rumour. His arrival transforms the harbour almost overnight from a lawless pirate haven into, at least on paper, an ordinary English colonial port, and the transformation splits the town's population cleanly along lines every man in Mother Cadence's rum house has been quietly weighing for weeks. Hundreds of pirates, including some of the era's most notorious names, come forward to accept the pardon, surrendering their weapons and their trade in exchange for a genuine chance at a legal life. Others, unwilling or unable to imagine any existence beyond the one they've built, slip out of the harbour in the weeks before and after Rogers's arrival, scattering to whatever havens remain, a diaspora that effectively marks the end of Nassau's brief, improbable run as a genuine republic of pirates. You watch Mother Cadence make her own choice in the days after Rogers's arrival, and it isn't the dramatic one you half expected from a woman who'd spent the better part of an evening predicting exactly this outcome. She doesn't flee, and she doesn't dramatically renounce anything. She simply keeps her rum house open, adjusts her prices slightly upward to account for the customs duties Rogers' new administration begins, however haltingly, to enforce, and continues serving whatever mix of newly pardoned former pirates, ordinary sailors, and colonial officials now finds its way through her door, her tally slate still running. Her credit system still operating on the same trust-based logic that's carried it through years of genuine lawlessness. It's not a triumphant ending, it's a practical one, and there's something quietly admirable about it. A woman who built a livelihood inside one brief historical window, finding a way to keep that same livelihood running once the window closed. Adapting rather than either fleeing or clinging to a freedom she'd already told you plainly, wasn't built to last. Your own last night in Nassau, before your ship makes its own decision about pardon or continued defiance, is quieter than you expected it to be, given everything churning through the town around you. Mother Cadence pours your last cup without charging for it, a small unspoken acknowledgement of however many evenings you've spent at her bar and the rum house. Half its usual clientele already gone or gone quiet with uncertainty about their own futures, feels for the first time since you arrived less like the wildest port in the Atlantic world, and more like an ordinary tavern anywhere, filled with ordinary, tired, uncertain people trying to figure out what comes next. You find yourself, somewhat to your own surprise, a little sad to be leaving it. Whatever choice your own captain and crew ultimately make about the pardon, sad in the particular, specific way you'd be sad to leave any place that had, however briefly and however strangely, felt something like home. Somewhere behind the bar, Josiah Kent's initials are still faintly visible, where he once idly scratched them into the wood with a borrowed knife. Waiting out a slow evening months before any of this uncertainty arrived, a small accidental monument to a young man Mother Cadence will likely never see again, left behind the way so much of Nassau's brief, improbable history is about to be left behind, half remembered, half erased, mattering enormously to the people who lived it, and barely at all to the world that would eventually write it. Down. There's a strange kind of wonder in that quiet, even now, the recognition that for a few short years, on this one unlikely stretch of Bahamian beach, several thousand people who'd have been hanged on sight almost anywhere else in the English-speaking world built something that functioned, however roughly, as a genuine self-governing community held together by rough councils, shared risk. And, more than either of those, an ocean of cheap, freely flowing rum that made the whole precarious arrangement bearable enough to sustain for as long as it did. Nassau's particular window closed in 1718, but rum's usefulness to men living just outside the reach of ordinary law didn't end with it. It simply migrated, over the following 2 centuries, to new coastlines, new smugglers, and new legal grey zones, waiting for the next moment history would offer it a comparably lawless stage to perform on. Modern Nassau, now a bustling cruise ship port with little visible trace of the wreck-strewn beach you walked ashore onto tonight, still trades heavily on that brief, improbable history, pirate-themed attractions and museum exhibits, doing a considerably tidier, considerably more sanitized version of the storytelling this chapter has just spent several thousand words trying to do honestly, complete with all the mess, uncertainty, and quiet human cost the tidier version tends to leave out. At 11 o'clock in the morning on July 31st, 1970, aboard Royal Navy ships around the world, a boatswain's call sounded for the very last time to announce up spirits. The traditional signal for the daily rum ration, a ceremony that had in one form or another run continuously since Admiral Vernon first diluted it into grog back in 1740, 230 years earlier. On more than one ship, according to accounts collected by naval historians in the years since, sailors marked the occasion with genuine ceremony rather than simple resignation. Black armbands worn for the day. A lone drummer playing a slow, mournful roll, and on at least one vessel, a small wooden top measure ceremonially thrown over the side into the sea, or in another version of the story, lowered in a miniature coffin as sailors stood at attention along the rail. The occasion earned its own nickname almost immediately. The way this drink's history seems to generate durable slang at every turn, Black Tot Day, still used by naval historians and rum enthusiasts to describe the moment the Royal Navy's rum ration, the direct institutional descendant of Vernon's 1740 order, finally came to a permanent end. The Admiralty's reasoning, laid out in official correspondence and parliamentary debate in the years leading up to the decision, had nothing to do with morality or temperance sentiment. The pressures that had driven earlier reductions to the ration across the 19th century. It had to do, instead, with the increasingly complex, dangerous machinery that a modern sailor was now expected to operate. A wooden sailing ship in Vernon's era demanded physical strength, seamanship and steady nerves, but relatively little in the way of fine technical precision. A 1970 destroyer, by contrast, demanded sailors capable of operating radar systems, guided missile controls, and nuclear propulsion machinery on vessels where a single impaired operator represented a genuinely catastrophic risk in a way no 18th century topman's afternoon buzz ever quite did. Naval officials had raised concerns along these lines for years before the final decision, commissioning internal studies on the ration's effect on reaction times and technical performance. Studies that consistently, if unsurprisingly, found measurable impairment even at the reduced eighth pint measure sailors were receiving by 1970. Parliamentary debate on the subject, recorded in Hansard, the official record of British parliamentary proceedings, reflects officials weighing this exact concern directly, treating the rum ration less as a beloved tradition worth preserving for its own sake, and more as an anachronism genuinely incompatible with the demands of a nuclear-age navy. The vote to abolish it passed, and the last official tot was poured on that July morning in 1970, ending a continuous institutional tradition considerably older than the United States itself. Sailors, characteristically, did not receive the news with universal enthusiasm, echoing almost precisely the grumbling resistance their 18th century predecessors had shown Vernon's original dilution order 2 centuries earlier. Contemporary newspaper coverage from the period describes sailors staging small, good-natured protests aboard several ships, mock funeral processions. Tots raised in ironic salute, a general air of theatrical mourning that suggests the men involved understood, even as they grumbled, that they were witnessing the genuine end of something rather than a mere policy adjustment. And the Navy, in a gesture that softened the loss slightly, distributed a one-time additional grant to the fleet's welfare funds in partial compensation for the ration's disappearance. A small institutional acknowledgement that something genuinely significant, however outdated, was being taken away. By the time of its abolition, the daily tot had shrunk considerably from Vernon's original half-pint measure down to an eighth of a pint, roughly 71 millilitres. Issued once daily to eligible ratings, officers had lost their own separate spirit ration decades earlier, meaning the ceremony's symbolic weight, by 1970, had long since outgrown its actual practical effect on any sailor's daily experience. It's a fittingly human end to a 230-year tradition, not abolished in anger or scandal, but retired, reluctantly and with genuine ceremony, by an institution that understood, even as it made the change, that it was closing a chapter considerably older than almost anything else still standing in its modern service. The story of that final 1970 ration didn't end when the last tot was poured, either, and the coda is worth including because it's one of the stranger, more delightful footnotes in this entire account. A quantity of the Royal Navy's original rum stock, some of it reportedly dating back decades, survived in Admiralty warehouses after the ration's abolition and decades later. In the early 21st century, a specialist company acquired and bottled a portion of those genuine remaining naval stores, releasing it commercially under the name Black Tot, allowing modern drinkers, for the first time since 1970, to taste something close to what generations of Royal Navy sailors had actually been issued each day for 230 years. It sold, unsurprisingly, as a genuine collector's curiosity, prized by rum enthusiasts precisely because it represented an artifact of a discontinued institutional tradition rather than merely another modern spirit. A small, commercially minded postscript to a ceremony that had, on that July morning in 1970, felt to the sailors observing it like a genuine funeral rather than a mere change in regulations. While the Royal Navy was still in 1970 only just beginning to imagine a world without its daily ration, an earlier and considerably more chaotic chapter in rum's story had already played out decades before, on the other side of the Atlantic, in the choppy, contested waters just beyond America's territorial limit. The 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution, ratified in 1919 and taking effect in January of 1920, banned the manufacture, sale and transportation of alcoholic beverages across the entire country. And almost overnight, created an enormous, thirsty and extraordinarily lucrative black market that a new generation of smugglers, some of them explicitly invoking the imagery of the pirates who'd come before them, rushed to fill. Rum, appropriately enough given everything traced through this account, gave an entire stretch of ocean its Prohibition-era nickname. Smuggling ships, many of them loaded with Caribbean rum among other spirits, anchored just outside the 3-mile limit of American territorial waters, the legal boundary beyond which Prohibition's enforcement couldn't reach, forming a loose, informal flotilla that newspapers and the smugglers themselves took to calling Rum Row, a floating black market stretched along the coastline, from which smaller, faster boats would dash out under cover of darkness to collect cargo and race it past the Coast Guard patrols now tasked with stopping them. In scenes that period accounts describe as genuinely resembling the ship-to-ship chases of the pirate era, this whole account has spent so long exploring, separated from Blackbeard's world by 2 centuries, but strikingly similar in their basic choreography of pursuit and evasion. The mechanics of Rum Row's operation, once established, ran with a logistical sophistication that would have impressed even the most organised pirate quartermaster from 2 centuries earlier. larger motherships, often foreign flagged and technically operating legally under international law so long as they remained beyond the 3-mile limit, anchored offshore loaded with cargo purchased legally in the Caribbean or Canada, functioning as floating warehouses rather than active smugglers themselves. Smaller, faster contact boats, purpose-built for speed, often more powerful than anything the undermanned, underfunded Coast Guard could initially field against them, would slip out from shore under cover of darkness, transfer cargo, and race back before patrol boats could intercept them. A cat-and-mouse dynamic that grew steadily more sophisticated and more dangerous on both sides as Prohibition wore on through the 1920s. The Coast Guard, initially outmatched, gradually expanded its own fleet with faster vessels and eventually resorted to more aggressive tactics, including armed confrontations that produced genuine casualties on both sides over the course of Prohibition's 13-year run, a level of violence that period newspaper coverage, drawing on exactly the kind of pirate-adjacent language discussed above, frequently described in terms lifted from adventure fiction rather than the grim, occasionally fatal law enforcement reality it actually represented. One name looms larger than most in the history of Rum Row, and it's worth including here because it gave the English language another durable piece of slang, in an echo of exactly the pattern that produced the word grog 2 centuries earlier. Bill McCoy, a Florida boat builder turned smuggler, built a genuine reputation during the early 1920s for a business practice that set him apart from many of his less scrupulous competitors. He reportedly refused to dilute or adulterate his rum and whiskey the way many rival smugglers did to stretch their profits, selling instead a consistently genuine, full-strength product that customers up and down the coast came to trust completely. Before Prohibition, McCoy and his brother had run a modest, entirely legal boat-building business in Florida, and it was that same practical maritime skill, rather than any prior criminal background, that carried directly into his smuggling career once the 18th Amendment made his previous honest trade considerably less profitable than the new opportunity suddenly presenting itself just. Offshore. He ran his operation, by most surviving accounts, with a notable absence of the violence that characterized many of his competitors, preferring reputation and reliability over the armed confrontation that increasingly defined Rum Row as the decade wore on, a business philosophy that earned him grudging respect even from the federal agents eventually tasked with bringing him down. According to a widely repeated account, popular enough to have entered common usage, even if its precise origins are debated among etymologists, in much the same way Rumbullion and Kill Devil were debated earlier in this story. Customers wanting to be certain they were buying McCoy's genuinely unadulterated product would specifically ask for the real McCoy, a phrase that outlived Prohibition, outlived McCoy's own smuggling career, and remains in common English usage today to describe anything authentic and unadulterated. A linguistic legacy considerably more durable than the fortune McCoy actually made from the trade itself, most of which he lost within a few years of his eventual arrest and brief imprisonment in 1925. He lived out the remainder of his life in relative quiet obscurity, a far cry from the outlaw glamour later popular culture would attach to his name, and died in 1948 aboard, fittingly enough, his own boat. The imagery Prohibition-era rum runners cultivated around themselves, deliberately in many cases, drew explicitly on the same pirate romanticism this entire account has spent 8 chapters complicating and contextualizing. Newspaper coverage of the era frequently described rum-running captains in language lifted almost directly from popular pirate fiction, daring, roguish. Operating just beyond the reach of a law widely regarded, even by many otherwise respectable citizens, as unjust or unenforceable, men doing for thirsty 1920s Americans roughly what the Nassau captains of 2 centuries earlier had done for anyone willing to look past a black flag. Some rum runners leaned into the comparison themselves, adopting colourful nicknames and cultivating a public image considerably more swashbuckling than the often mundane logistics-heavy reality of running a smuggling operation actually required. Aware that a public half sympathetic to their trade responded better to a romantic outlaw than to an ordinary businessman simply exploiting a profitable legal loophole in international waters. It's a reminder that the romantic version of piracy this account has worked throughout to complicate with fuller, harder historical context was never simply an invention of later novelists and filmmakers. It was already being actively constructed, consciously and for commercial advantage, by the smugglers of the 1920s themselves. Borrowing costume and legend from a golden age already 200 years in the past, by the time Rum Rose boats were racing federal patrols under cover of darkness. That romantic borrowing never really stopped, and it's visible today on nearly every liquor store shelf carrying rum, in branding decisions that draw explicitly and profitably on exactly the pirate history this account has spent its length trying to render in fuller, more complicated detail than the label on a bottle typically allows. Captain Morgan, one of the best-selling rum brands in the world today, takes its name and its mustachioed, boot-planted mascot directly from Henry Morgan, the same Welsh privateer whose Port Royal exploits appeared briefly in this account's second chapter, a historical figure who was, in his own century, a legally commissioned privateer rather than an outlaw pirate for much of his career, and who was in fact knighted by the English crown and served as Jamaica's lieutenant governor later in life. A biographical detail the swashbuckling bottle label conveniently omits in favour of a more marketable rogue's image. Skull and crossbones imagery, black flag branding, and swashbuckling mascots appear across dozens of other rum labels worldwide. A commercial afterlife that has, more than any history book, shaped how millions of people today first encounter the loose idea of pirates and rum belonging together, largely disconnected from the specific, documented, considerably messier reality this account has tried to trace from a Barbadian boiling house through Tobias Fenwick's cracked pewter cup, all the way to a Royal Navy sailor's black armband in 1970. Not every corner of the modern rum industry leans on skull and crossbones marketing, and it's worth giving the more historically grounded end of that industry its due before this chapter closes, because it circles back, in its own quiet way, to nearly every earlier chapter of this account. Several of the Caribbean's oldest, continuously operating distilleries, some tracing their history directly back to the plantation economies discussed in this story's second chapter, still produce rum using methods and, in some cases, physical equipment genuinely connecting back through multiple centuries of continuous production, and heritage-focused rum makers on islands including Barbados and Jamaica increasingly market themselves not on pirate romanticism at all, but on precisely the kind of documented historical lineage this account has tried to trace throughout: molasses, copper stills, and centuries of accumulated distilling knowledge, much of it originally developed, uncredited, by enslaved distillers whose individual names the historical record chose not to preserve. Some of these same distilleries have, in recent years, begun commissioning their own historical research into exactly that erased labour, a small, ongoing corrective effort that will likely never fully recover the names lost to 3 centuries of indifferent record-keeping, but that at least acknowledges the debt more honestly than a cartoon mascot ever could. It's a more complicated, more honest kind of marketing than a cartoon pirate mascot allows for, acknowledging a history that includes genuine atrocity alongside genuine craft, and it's slowly gaining ground among drinkers more interested in what's actually in the bottle, and where it actually came from than in the swashbuckling story printed on the label. That 1651 document, the one that first put Rumbullion, alias Kill Divil, into writing, still exists, preserved among colonial records now held in archives on both sides of the Atlantic. A single unglamorous administrative paper that neither its author nor anyone reading it at the time could possibly have guessed would end up, 3.5 centuries later, cited in bars, history books, and rum bottle labels as the founding document of an entire global industry. It's a fitting kind of survival for a drink whose whole history has run this way, significant far beyond what anyone present at its origin could have predicted, remembered in fragments and disputed etymologies rather than clean, tidy narrative, carried forward less by any single decision than by 3 centuries of ordinary people finding it useful, comforting, or profitable enough to keep passing along to the next generation. It's worth pausing, before this account's final thesis, to hold all of these threads together at once, because they were never really separate stories, however far apart in time and geography they've ranged across this account. The same drink that Tobias Fenwick poured from a cracked pewter cup on a becalmed pirate ship in the 1710s is, at the level of basic chemistry and cultural function, recognisably the same drink that Royal Navy sailors mourned in 1970 and that Bill McCoy refused to water down for his Prohibition-era customers 2 centuries after Fenwick's own voyage. What changed across 300 years wasn't the substance itself so much as who controlled it, and on what terms an elected quartermaster answerable to a voting crew, an admiral answerable to no one aboard his own ship, a Bahamian tavern keeper answerable only to her own ledger and her own sense of fairness, a modern corporation answerable primarily to shareholders and a marketing budget. Rum, across all of that change, proved remarkably good at absorbing whatever meaning the people controlling it needed it to carry. Comfort, currency, discipline, rebellion. Nostalgia, profit, it never demanded any single fixed identity for itself, which may be the truest explanation for why a molasses byproduct from a 17th century Barbadian boiling house is still in the 21st century sitting on nearly every bar shelf on earth, 370 years after that first uncertain 1651 document tried, not entirely successfully, to give it a name. This then is the final turn in the long tangled story of rum, a drink born from a Caribbean plantation's waste product and an enslaved workforce history barely bothered to name, adopted by pirate crews as currency, comfort, an occasional cause of death, formalised and diluted by an English admiral whose own nickname it stole, ceremonially retired by a modern navy that had finally outgrown it. Smuggled by Prohibition-era rum runners consciously borrowing pirate costume for their own considerably more recent outlaw trade, and finally commercialised, skull and crossbones label and all, into one of the most recognisable spirits on earth, carrying, in every bottle sold today, echoes of Tobias Fenwick's cracked pewter cup, Silas Grant's careful chalk tally, Mother Cadence's trust-based slate, and Blackbeard's carefully cultivated, only partially deserved legend, whether the person buying it ever thinks about any of that history at all. 370 years separate that first uncertain 1651 mention of rum bullion and kill devil from tonight, and across every one of those years, in every form this drink has taken, ration, currency, contraband, collector's bottle, marketing mascot, it has never once stopped doing the same basic thing it did in Tobias Fenwick's cracked pewter cup on that very first morning this account described, giving ordinary, exhausted, frightened people some small measure of comfort against whatever the world happened to be asking of them that day. 370 years, from a sweltering boiling house on Barbados to a coffin lowered off a warship's rail in 1970, and somehow it all comes back, in the end, to the same small human gesture this whole night began with, a cup, offered and accepted, between people who needed, however briefly, to feel less alone in something difficult. Tobias Fenwick is still pouring somewhere in the quiet part of your memory now, cracked pewter cup catching the last of a Caribbean sunset, humming a tune nobody ever asked him to explain. Ezra Wren is still teaching a frightened boy to read the clouds on a becalmed evening that never quite ends. Mother Cadence is still wiping down her bar in a Nassau that technically stopped existing the way you saw it centuries ago, and somewhere off Ocracoke. The tide is still turning over the same shallow water it always has, indifferent to legends built on top of it. None of that is asking anything of you tonight. It never was. The ration's been poured, the tally's been kept. The coffin went over the rail a long time ago now, and the only cup left in this story is the one you're not holding. Just the quiet. And the dark, and whatever small comfort you've carried with you this far. You're warm. You're safe. The ships have all found their harbours, one way or another, and so, for tonight, have you. That's enough. That's everything, really. Sleep well.